Picture a world where the fate of empires did not rest on the famous clashes you learned about in school, but on forgotten battles fought in dusty deserts and remote mountain passes, struggles so pivotal they redirected the course of history, yet somehow slipped through the cracks of our collective memory. We often hear about epic sieges like Jerusalem or Acre, moments that echo loudly in the story of the Crusades. But behind those legendary events lies a hidden tapestry of conflicts that truly shaped the medieval world. These were the battles that determined the rise and fall of kingdoms, forged unexpected alliances, and quietly sculpted the cultural and political landscape of an era defined by faith, ambition, and survival. Welcome to the untold stories of the Crusades, a journey into the heart of conflicts you have never heard of, but without which history, as we know, it would look entirely different. Think about it. While grand narratives often focus on kings and popes, the real turning points emerged in places whose names have been all but lost to time. A fortress in Syria, a coastal town in the Levant, a stark field in Anatolia. In these overlooked clashes, the destinies of knights, sultans, and soldiers were decided, not with the fanfare of textbooks, but through grit, strategy, and moments of sheer human drama. These battles redefined borders, shifted power between civilizations, and even influenced the flow of ideas between East and West. They were the unsung hinges upon which history swung, and yet, for centuries, they have remained in the shadows, waiting for their stories to be told. In this video, we are going to uncover 25 of these legendary battles, each one a crucial piece of the puzzle that was the Crusader era. From desperate sieges that tested the limits of human endurance to cunning ambushes that changed the course of wars, we will explore how these forgotten conflicts shaped the world we live in today. This is not just a list of names and dates. It is an invitation to see history in a new light, to understand how the echoes of these struggles still resonate in our modern world. So prepare to journey beyond the familiar headlines and into the heart of the action, where the fate of empires was often decided in the dust and heat of battles you have never heard of. Let's dive in. To truly appreciate these forgotten battles, we need to step back and see the Crusades not as a simple holy war, but as a sprawling 200-year drama where faith, ambition, and survival collided on a global stage. It all began in the year 1095, when Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont, France, and called for an armed pilgrimage to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. This wasn't just a religious decree, it was a political masterstroke that tapped into a deep well of piety, but also a desire for land, trade, and prestige among the knights and nobles of a fractured Europe. What followed was a series of massive military expeditions, but the reality on the ground was far more nuanced than a simple clash of civilizations. For nearly 2 centuries, the Eastern Mediterranean became a melting pot, a bloody frontier where Europeans, Arabs, Turks, Byzantines, and Armenians fought, traded, and surprisingly often learned from one another. While the famous captures of Jerusalem and the tragic disasters like the Battle of Hattin capture our imagination, the day-to-day reality of maintaining these fragile Crusader states relied on countless smaller engagements. The survival of a kingdom could hinge on a single caravan successfully reaching a besieged castle, or a local truce negotiated with a neighboring emir. This era was defined by its complex web of alliances, where a Crusader baron might ally with a Muslim sultan against a rival Christian prince, or where the arrival of a Mongol envoy could suddenly shift the entire balance of power. It was a world of constant negotiation, espionage, and economic pressure, where silk and spices flowed as freely as blood. Technological innovations, from the design of towering trebuchets to the breeding of a specific type of warhorse, could mean the difference between a fortress standing or falling. This rich, complicated context is why these lesser-known battles are so vital. They are the missing pieces that complete the puzzle. They show us the pivotal moments where a campaign could have succeeded or failed based on a single decision made in the heat of a skirmish most history books have ignored. By understanding the economic strains that pushed armies to raid for supplies, the religious fervor that could motivate a last stand, or the political betrayal that opened a vulnerable frontier, we gain a much deeper, more human understanding of this era. We move beyond the myth and into the reality, setting the stage to uncover the first of these hidden turning points, a siege so brutal it would shock the medieval world and cement the Crusaders' ruthless reputation. Fresh from their hard-fought capture of Antioch, the Crusader army pushed south into Syria, not as a triumphant force, but as a desperate and starving horde. The winter of 1098 was brutally cold, and their supplies had dwindled to nothing. Their target was the well-provisioned town of Marat al-Numan, a key stronghold perched on the road to Jerusalem. The townspeople, confident in their formidable walls, believed they could withstand these foreign invaders. They had no idea they were about to become the center of one of the most horrifying and psychologically defining moments of the entire crusading era. The siege itself was a brutal affair of attrition. The Crusaders, lacking proper siege engines, resorted to building a towering wooden fort they nicknamed La Mahomery, and pushed it right up against the city walls to overwhelm the defenders. After weeks of fierce fighting and a final, bloody assault, the walls were breached. What followed was a massacre typical of the time, but the true horror began after the fighting stopped. The Crusaders had taken the town, but they found far less food than they had hoped for. Facing the very real prospect of starvation in the dead of winter, something snapped within the army. Driven by a terrifying mix of hunger and a fanatical belief that their cause was divinely sanctioned, some segments of the Frankish forces committed acts that would echo through history and forever stain their reputation. Contemporary chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, document that the Crusaders resorted to cannibalism, butchering the bodies of the dead Saracens and cooking their flesh. While the scale was likely exaggerated for propaganda purposes, the mere occurrence was seismic. For the Islamic world, it was ultimate proof of the Crusaders' barbarism and inhumanity, a powerful tool used for decades to unite resistance against them. For the Crusaders themselves, it was a grim testament to the extreme lengths they were willing to go for survival and their faith. Yet, from this abyss of despair emerged a crucial strategic victory. The capture of Marat al-Numan provided the Crusaders with that desperately needed foothold in northern Syria. It proved they could adapt, could fight, and win even when exhausted and far from home. The horrific lessons of the siege were not lost on their leaders. They learned, in the most visceral way possible, that future success would depend utterly on securing supply lines and managing logistics. This understanding would shape their tactics for the remainder of the campaign. The town's fall also created a deep rift within the army, sparking a fierce debate between those who wanted to consolidate their gains and those who were hellbent on marching immediately toward Jerusalem, a division that would nearly tear the crusade apart before it even reached its ultimate goal. If the siege of Marat al-Numan was a lesson in the brutal economics of survival, the Battle of Haran, just 6 years later, would become a devastating masterclass in military overextension. The year was 1104, and the newly established Crusader States were riding a wave of confidence. They had secured a foothold in the Levant, but ambition now pulled their gaze eastward, toward the incredibly fertile and strategically vital plains of northern Mesopotamia. It was a land of immense wealth and crucial trade routes, a prize that seemed within grasp for the aggressive Frankish lords of Edessa and Antioch. Count Baldwin II of Edessa and his counterpart, Bohemond of Antioch, saw an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against their Seljuk Turkish rivals and dramatically expand their fledgling territories. What they failed to anticipate was that they were not the hunters but the prey being lured into a perfect trap. The campaign began with what seemed like a golden opportunity. The Seljuk Atabeg of Mosul, Jekamish, and his rival Sokman of Mardin were embroiled in a bitter dispute over control of the city of Haran. Seeing this internal conflict as a moment of weakness, Baldwin and Bohemond assembled a combined force, confident that their heavy cavalry, the famed Frankish knights who had steamrolled so many opponents, would easily crush the divided Turkish forces. They marched out not with caution but with the swagger of inevitable victory. However, the Turkish commanders, for all their rivalry, understood the greater threat posed by the Crusaders. In a moment of pragmatic alliance, they temporarily set aside their differences and united their armies, waiting for the Franks to make the first fatal move. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical deception and mobility. The Crusader army, burdened by its heavy armor and reliant on the classic charge that had served them so well in Europe, found itself completely outmaneuvered on the open plains. The Turkish forces refused to engage in a static, head-on collision. Instead, they employed the classic steppe nomad strategy that would haunt Western armies for centuries, the feigned retreat. Their clouds of light horse archers would sweep in, unleash a storm of arrows to provoke and harass the Crusader lines, and then suddenly wheel away, pretending to flee in disarray. The Frankish knights, seeing what they thought was a routing enemy, took the bait. They broke formation and charged in pursuit, their discipline evaporating in the heat of the moment. This was exactly what the Turkish commanders had planned. As the Crusader charge stretched out and lost its cohesion, the main Seljuk force calmly enveloped them. The knights, now isolated, exhausted, and their horses vulnerable to the constant arrow fire, were systematically cut down. It was a total tactical disaster. Count Baldwin himself was captured, and his army was nearly annihilated. The survivors fled in a chaotic rout, leaving the field and the future of their eastern ambitions in the hands of the triumphant Seljuks. The immediate consequence was the severe weakening of the county of Edessa, which lost its leader and the core of its military strength in a single afternoon. But the true impact of Haran was far more profound and long-lasting. This was not just a lost battle, it was a strategic earthquake that reshaped the entire political landscape of the Crusader East. The myth of Frankish invincibility on the battlefield was shattered. Muslim powers, particularly the Artukid dynasty, saw this crushing victory as undeniable proof that the Crusaders could be beaten, and beaten soundly with the right tactics and leadership. It emboldened them, fueling a new wave of resistance and unity that would eventually coalesce under leaders like Zengi and Nur ad-Din. For the Crusader States, the defeat forced a complete and painful reassessment. The dream of endless expansion eastward was over, replaced by a new, grim reality of consolidation and defense. They could no longer afford to be the aggressors. They had to learn how to survive behind their walls, forever looking over their shoulders at a newly confident and dangerous enemy. While the disastrous overreach at Haran had taught the Crusaders a painful lesson about the perils of desert warfare, a different kind of strategy was already proving its worth along the Mediterranean coast. The key to lasting power in the Levant, it turned out, was not just controlling the land but commanding the sea. This crucial understanding came into sharp focus in the year 1110, as King Baldwin I of Jerusalem set his sights on one of the coast's most glittering prizes, the ancient and immensely wealthy port city of Sidon. For Baldwin, capturing Sidon was about more than just adding another city to his kingdom. It was about completing a strategic masterstroke. The Crusaders already held Jerusalem, Antioch, and Edessa inland, but their grip on the region felt fragile, like a necklace missing its central jewel. The coastal cities were the lifelines, the channels through which supplies, reinforcements, and most importantly, money, could flow from Europe. Sidon, with its deep natural harbor and legendary status as a center for glassmaking, dye production, and trade, represented the ultimate link in this chain. Its fall would finally connect the northern and southern Crusader holdings, creating a continuous strip of Christian-controlled coastline that could be supplied and reinforced by sea, forever freeing them from the vulnerability of overland routes that were so easily ambushed. But taking a city as formidable as Sidon was a task far beyond the capabilities of Baldwin's army alone. Its massive landward walls were daunting, and its Egyptian garrison was determined and well supplied. Baldwin understood that to win here, he needed to become a master of coalition warfare, and he looked not east but west to the rising maritime empire of Venice. A deal was struck, one that would set a precedent for centuries of Crusader-Italian relations. In exchange for their invaluable naval assistance, the Venetians were promised their own autonomous quarter within the captured city, exemption from taxes, and privileged trading rights that would funnel the wealth of the East directly into their coffers. This was not a purely pious venture. It was a commercial and strategic partnership where both sides stood to gain immensely. The arrival of the Venetian fleet, a formidable armada of war galleys and transport ships, was the turning point. They immediately imposed a suffocating naval blockade, cutting Sidon off from any hope of reinforcement or resupply by sea. This naval noose, combined with Baldwin's forces pressing from the land, created a perfect siege, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of combined arms operations. The siege itself was a grueling test of wills. For weeks, the defenders held out, hoping for a relief force from the Egyptian Fatimid fleet that never materialized, thanks to the vigilant Venetian patrols. Within the city walls, the situation grew increasingly desperate, and here the story takes a fascinating turn that reveals the complex, often pragmatic reality of the Crusader era. The city's ruler, a man caught between the demands of his distant Egyptian overlords and the immediate survival of his people, began secret negotiations with Baldwin. He saw the writing on the wall, the unstoppable combination of Frankish land power and Venetian sea power, and made a calculated decision to switch sides to save himself and his city from the inevitable sack that would follow a forceful conquest. This kind of local diplomacy, where allegiances were fluid and survival often trumped ideology, was a recurring theme. The final surrender was negotiated, not dictated. In return for handing over the city, its ruler and many of its inhabitants were granted safe passage out. Sidon fell not in a cataclysm of blood and fire, but through a tense, practical agreement. The victory's impact was immediate and profound. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, it was a massive infusion of wealth and security. Control of Sidon's harbor meant safer passage for pilgrim ships and merchant vessels, which in turn filled the royal treasury with customs duties and trade revenues. This economic windfall allowed Baldwin to fund further campaigns, reward his knights, and fortify his other holdings. For the Venetians, it was the establishment of a powerful and lucrative colonial outpost, the first of many that would form their commercial empire in the East. But perhaps most importantly, the siege of Sidon proved a vital strategic principle. In the Crusader East, mastery of the coast was the foundation of survival. It showed that success could be bought not just with swords and lances, but with ships and trade agreements, and that sometimes the most valuable ally in a holy war was a pragmatic merchant from a distant republic. This hard-won lesson in naval power and economic incentive would become a cornerstone of Crusader strategy for the next century. Just 2 decades after the disaster at Haran, the strategic landscape of the Crusader States had grown even more perilous. A new and formidable Muslim leader was rising to power, Imad ad-Din Zengi, the ambitious Atabeg of Mosul, whose dream was to unite the fractured Islamic Emirates and systematically expel the Franks from the Levant. His first major target was the vulnerable northern state of Antioch, and the key to unlocking its defenses was the strategic town of Azaz, a crucial frontier fortress guarding the approaches to the principality. If Azaz fell, the gates to Antioch itself would be thrown wide open, threatening the very existence of one of the most important Crusader realms. It was in this atmosphere of gathering storm clouds that King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, a ruler who had himself endured the humiliation of captivity after Haran, decided to roll the dice on a daring preemptive strike. He would not wait to be besieged, he would take the fight to the enemy. Baldwin's masterstroke was not just military but diplomatic. He managed to assemble a truly unified Crusader army, a rare feat given the constant squabbling and rivalries between the different states. He brought together the full force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and was joined by the Knights of Antioch, the often independent forces from the county of Tripoli, and even a contingent of Armenian allies. This coalition represented a momentary setting aside of personal ambitions for the greater good of the Frankish cause. They marched north not as a collection of rival lords, but as a singular, determined force, their eyes fixed on relieving the pressure on Azaz and shattering Zengi's growing aura of invincibility before it could solidify. The battle that unfolded near Azaz was a brilliant demonstration of how much the Crusaders had learned from their earlier defeats. They were no longer the overconfident, heavy-handed force that had charged to its doom at Haran. Facing a larger Seljuk army, Baldwin and his commanders employed superior intelligence and cunning tactics. They used the terrain to their advantage, likely luring the overconfident Muslim forces into an unfavorable position. The exact details are lost to time, but chronicles speak of a well-executed ambush or a perfectly timed flank attack that threw the Seljuk ranks into chaos. The Crusader Knights, this time maintaining their discipline, delivered a devastating charge at the critical moment, routing the enemy completely. It was a stunning and comprehensive victory against the odds, a testament to the power of unity and adaptive strategy. The immediate spoils of war were immense. The Crusaders captured a huge amount of loot, including vast herds of livestock, precious silks, and most importantly, a large number of high-value prisoners. In the medieval economy, noble captives were walking bank accounts, ransomed for enormous sums of silver. This windfall provided a crucial financial infusion for the nearly bankrupt Crusader kingdoms, funding the pay for soldiers and the construction of new fortifications for years to come. Morally, the victory was even more significant. After years of playing defense and watching Muslim power coalesce under Zengi, the triumph at Azaz was a powerful shot of adrenaline for the Christian cause. It proved that even this new, threatening enemy could be beaten on the open field. Historians often point to Azaz as a pivotal delaying action in the grand narrative of the Crusades. By crushing this army and humiliating Zengi's ambitions, Baldwin II bought the fragile county of Edessa an extra 2 decades of precarious existence. It was a stay of execution, a vital breath of air for a state that was already on borrowed time. This victory allowed the Crusaders to consolidate their northern frontiers and gave European reinforcements precious time to arrive. But the win also contained the seeds of its own limitation. It was a tactical masterpiece, not a strategic endgame. Zengi was wounded but not broken. He would learn from this defeat, bide his time, and return more determined than ever. The Battle of Az was a brilliant flash of lightning that illuminated the path to victory, but it could not hold back the coming storm forever. It was a reminder that in the relentless struggle for the Holy Land, even the most glorious triumphs were often just temporary respites. If the victory at Az had been a moment of brilliant, unified strength for the Crusaders, the Battle of Inab, just 24 years later, would be its tragic and bloody opposite, a stark lesson in the catastrophic price of arrogance and division. The stage was set in the summer of 1149, a time of simmering tension in the Principality of Antioch. Its ruler, the charismatic and ambitious Prince Raymond of Poitiers, was a seasoned warrior who had held his own against the rising tide of Muslim resistance for over a decade. He was confident, perhaps overly so, in his own military prowess and his ability to defend his sprawling territories. His primary adversary was a new star in the Islamic firmament, Nur ad-Din, the son of the great Zengi, a leader who was not only a brilliant strategist but also a master of propaganda, tirelessly promoting the idea of jihad to unite the fractured Muslim world against the Franks. The spark that ignited the conflict was a relatively minor one. Nur ad-Din had moved to besiege the fortress of Inab, a key stronghold in Antioch's eastern frontier. Prince Raymond, seeing this as a direct challenge to his authority, decided to ride out and meet the threat head-on, a decision that would seal his fate and alter the course of history. Raymond's first and most critical mistake was one of gross underestimation. He assembled a modest force, believing it would be sufficient to deal with what he perceived as a limited incursion. In a move that would prove fateful, he allied himself with Ali ibn Waffa, the leader of the heterodox Shia Muslim sect known as the Assassins, who were themselves bitter enemies of Nur ad-Din's Sunni orthodoxy. This alliance, while politically shrewd in the complex web of Levantine politics, did little to bolster Raymond's military strength. As they marched, scouts brought reports of the true size of Nur ad-Din's army. It was far larger and more formidable than Raymond had anticipated. At this pivotal moment, his seasoned military judgment should have told him to retreat to a more defensible position, to wait for reinforcements, or to force Nur ad-Din into a costly assault on a well-defended castle. But pride intervened. To turn back now, he likely thought, would be seen as an act of cowardice, a stain on his honor, and a sign of weakness to both his allies and his enemies. He pressed on, a decision that spoke volumes about the powerful role of chivalric culture and personal vanity in the strategic blunders of the era. Nur ad-Din, a master of psychological and tactical warfare, understood his opponent perfectly. He knew Raymond's pride would not allow him to retreat, and he used the terrain with devastating effectiveness. The area around Inab was a rugged landscape of hills and valleys, perfect for concealing troop movements and launching ambushes. As Raymond's force advanced, they found themselves funneled into a position where their numerical disadvantage became a death sentence. Nur ad-Din's troops, highly disciplined and motivated by their leader's religious fervor, surrounded the Crusader army. The battle was not a prolonged clash of armies, but a swift and brutal execution. The Frankish knights, trapped and overwhelmed, were cut down where they stood. Prince Raymond and his ally Ali ibn Waffa both fought to their last breath, but they never stood a chance. The field was left littered with the dead, and among them was the head of the Principality of Antioch itself. The immediate aftermath was one of sheer panic and despair. The Principality of Antioch, now leaderless and stripped of its primary field army, was effectively defenseless. Its capital city lay open and vulnerable. Only a desperate, last-minute rally by the Patriarch and the city's citizens prevented Nur ad-Din from marching straight through its gates. But the damage was done. The psychological blow was even greater than the military one. The invincible aura of the Frankish knight had been shattered once again, but this time it was a prince who had fallen. For Nur ad-Din, the victory was a political goldmine. He took Raymond's ornate sword and his severed head, sending them as trophies to the caliph in Baghdad. This grisly proof of his triumph made him an instant legend throughout the Islamic world, the undisputed champion of the faith. It allowed him to consolidate his power, presenting himself not just as a political ruler, but as the true leader of the Muslim counter-crusade. Inab directly paved the way for his eventual capture of Damascus, unifying Muslim Syria under his banner and creating a powerful, centralized state that would later be perfected by Saladin. The fall of the county of Edessa, which had been teetering for years, was now an inevitability. Its fate was sealed not at its own walls, but on the bloody field of Inab. This battle stands as a somber monument to the fact that in war, the greatest enemy is often not the army across the field, but the hubris residing in the heart of a commander. While the disastrous defeat at Inab had crippled the northern Crusader states, the gaze of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was pulled in a different direction, toward a land of unimaginable wealth and ancient power that promised to solve all their problems, Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo was the sick man of the region, a decaying empire riven by internal palace coups, famines, and military weakness, yet it remained phenomenally rich, controlling the fertile Nile Delta and the lucrative trade routes to the east. For King Amalric I, a shrewd and ambitious ruler, Egypt was not just a target, it was the ultimate prize. He envisioned a grand strategy where control of Egypt would provide his kingdom with a near-limitless source of grain, gold, and manpower, effectively encircling his Muslim rivals and securing the Holy Land for centuries to come. The Siege of Bilbays in 1168 was the violent, pivotal moment when this grand dream began to curdle into a catastrophic nightmare, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately unleash the Crusaders' greatest nemesis. King Amalric's plan was a masterpiece of political opportunism. He did not launch a blind invasion. He was essentially invited in. The Vizier of Egypt, Shawar, was a man perpetually dancing on a knife's edge, trying to maintain his own power amidst the chaotic swirl of Fatimid court politics. Facing a revolt from within his own ranks, he made a desperate plea for help to the one power he believed could stabilize the situation, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For Amalric, this was the invitation he had been waiting for. He marched his army into Egypt not as a blatant conqueror, but as an ally answering a call for assistance, a thin veneer of legitimacy that he hoped would smooth his path to ultimate control. His first major objective was the fortress of Bilbays, a key stronghold guarding the approaches to Cairo itself. The siege was brutal and efficient. The Frankish army, experienced and well-led, quickly overwhelmed the defenses. What followed, however, was not the orderly transfer of power Amalric might have hoped for. The sack of the city was reportedly so vicious and thorough that it shocked even the cynical observers of the era. This act of extreme violence, committed against the people he was supposedly there to aid, instantly turned any potential Egyptian goodwill into ashes and bitter hatred. Shawar, the man who had invited him, now looked upon his Frankish allies with horror and betrayal, realizing he had unleashed a wolf into his own house. This is where the brilliant complexity of Crusader diplomacy collapsed into a tangled web of mistrust and conflicting ambitions. Amalric's entire strategy hinged on a second, even more powerful alliance with the Byzantine Empire. A massive fleet from Constantinople was supposed to sail to join him, combining the land power of Jerusalem with the unparalleled naval might of Byzantium to deliver a knockout blow to Egypt. But the fleet was late, weeks turned into months, and the ships never arrived. The reasons for the delay are lost to history, perhaps bureaucratic inertia, unfavorable winds, or simple miscommunication, but its impact was decisive. Amalric's army was now stuck deep inside enemy territory, its supplies dwindling, its ranks thinning from disease, and with no sign of the promised reinforcements. He was holding Bilbays, but he was isolated, overextended, and rapidly losing control of the situation. The local Egyptian factions, including the betrayed vizier Shawar, now saw the Franks not as saviors but as a plague to be expelled by any means necessary. And that is exactly when the third player entered the game with devastating timing. From the north, Nur ad-Din, the unifier of Muslim Syria, had been watching Amalric's Egyptian adventure with mounting alarm. The last thing he needed was the Crusaders establishing themselves in the wealthy Nile Valley, which would put them in a position to strangle his own domains. Seizing the perfect opportunity, he dispatched his most trusted and brilliant general, Shirkuh, to invade Egypt under the banner of protecting the Islamic world from the Frankish threat. Shirkuh did not come with a massive army, but with a small, elite force. His arrival transformed the conflict entirely. To the desperate Egyptians, he appeared not as an invader, but as a liberator. Vizier Shawar, in a breathtaking act of political survival, immediately switched sides again, now allying with Shirkuh to eject the Franks he had himself called in. King Amalric suddenly found himself trapped between the crumbling walls of Bilbays and two converging enemy armies. His grand invasion had disintegrated into a desperate fight for survival. Facing certain annihilation, he was forced to agree to a humiliating withdrawal, abandoning all his gains and marching his depleted army back to Jerusalem, his tail between his legs. The failure at Bilbays was far more than a single lost siege. It was a geopolitical earthquake whose aftershocks would define the next century. The immediate consequence was the total evaporation of Frankish influence in Egypt. But the long-term consequence was infinitely more dire. Shirkuh's successful intervention paved the way for his rise to the position of Vizier of Egypt. And when he died just a few months later, his nephew, a young, devout, and incredibly capable officer named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin, stepped into his place. Within 2 years, Saladin would abolish the weak Fatimid Caliphate, unite Egypt with Syria under his own rule, and encircle the Crusader kingdoms in a pincer of iron. The very nightmare that Nur ad-Din had sought to prevent, he inadvertently created, but for the other side. The Crusader adventure in Egypt had backfired catastrophically, forging the very unified Muslim power that would eventually spell their doom. The Siege of Bilbays stands as a tragic lesson in the law of unintended consequences, where a short-sighted grab for power can inadvertently create the very enemy capable of destroying you. Yet the kingdom's triumph was not born from overwhelming force, but from a series of near-catastrophic miscalculations and a desperate, last-minute gamble. Saladin, confident in his intelligence, reports that the main Frankish army was dispersed and the young leper king was secluded in Jerusalem, saw a golden opportunity. He divided his own forces, sending a large contingent to raid the city of Ascalon, and believing he could sweep through the undefended heart of the kingdom with impunity. What he did not anticipate was the sheer, defiant will of Baldwin IV. The king, though his body was being slowly consumed by disease, possessed a mind of sharp strategic clarity and an indomitable spirit. Upon hearing of Saladin's move, he made a breathtaking decision. instead of hunkering down behind the walls of Jerusalem, he would gather every available man, a pitifully small force of just a few hundred knights and a couple thousand foot soldiers, and march out to intercept the most powerful military leader in the Islamic world. The two armies met near the castle of Montezard, close to the town of Ramla, and the sight that greeted Saladin must have seemed like a mirage. There, arrayed against his veteran professional army, was a tiny, ragged Crusader force. The odds were not just unfavorable, they were ludicrous, but Baldwin and his commanders, including the legendary Reynold of Chatillon, turned their weakness into a strength. They chose their ground with care, positioning their men on a sandy, uneven terrain that hampered the maneuvering of Saladin's cavalry. And then, they did something that transformed a military engagement into a legend. Before the battle lines clashed, the Bishop of Bethlehem presented the kingdom's most sacred relic, the fragment of the true cross, upon which Christ was believed to have been crucified. For the outnumbered Frankish soldiers, this was not just a symbol, it was a physical manifestation of divine favor. It ignited a fervor that transcended fear. What happened next was less a battle and more an avalanche of faith and steel. King Baldwin, too weak to stand unaided, was helped onto his horse and led the charge himself. His knights, inspired to a state of near frenzy, followed him in a furious, headlong assault directly into the heart of the Muslim ranks. Saladin's army, which had been pillaging and was not expecting a pitched battle, was caught completely off guard by the ferocity and audacity of the attack. Their lines wavered, then buckled, and then broke into a full-scale rout. The chronicles describe a slaughter, with Saladin himself only narrowly escaping the field, fleeing on a pack camel as his personal bodyguard was cut down around him. It was a miraculous, seemingly impossible victory, a moment where sheer belief and courage had defied every rational calculation of military power. In the immediate aftermath, Montezard was celebrated as a divine miracle. It shattered Saladin's aura of invincibility and forced him to retreat to Egypt to rebuild his shattered army and reputation. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, it provided a vital breathing space, a few precious years of respite from the relentless pressure. But the brilliant flash of victory also illuminated the kingdom's profound and terrifying vulnerabilities. The win had been entirely dependent on the charismatic, almost reckless bravery of its dying king and the religious fervor of the moment. It was a triumph of personality, not of institutions or sustainable military strength. The underlying problems remained: a critical shortage of manpower, bitter rivalries among the nobility, and an enemy who was learning, adapting, and growing stronger with every passing season. Montezard was the ultimate peak of Crusader heroism, a story that would be told for generations to come, but it was also the last glorious gasp of a kingdom living on borrowed time. It proved that even a leper king could be a lion in battle, but it could not change the grim mathematics of survival in a land surrounded by enemies. High atop a stark, wind-scoured ridge in the deserts of modern-day Jordan, the immense fortress of Kerak stood as a monstrous testament to Crusader ambition, a sprawling complex of towers, vaulted halls, and daunting walls that dominated the vital trade routes between Damascus and Egypt. It was more than just a castle. It was a statement of permanent occupation, a thorn deeply embedded in the side of the growing Muslim power unified under Saladin. By the year 1183, the tension between these two forces was a taut bowstring, and Kerak was the point where everyone expected it to snap. The stage was set not for a simple military engagement, but for a dramatic event that would blend high politics, personal vendettas, and chivalric spectacle into a siege that would become the stuff of legend, all because of a wedding. The master of this formidable stronghold was Reynold of Chatillon, a man who was, depending on one's perspective, either the most daring of the Crusader lords or the most reckless and dangerous provocateur. Reynold had a long history of antagonizing Saladin, from launching pirate fleets on the Red Sea to threaten the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, to attacking richly laden caravans under the supposed protection of truces. To Saladin, Reynold was not just an enemy, he was a personal nemesis, a man whose very existence was an insult to be avenged. And Reynold, in his typical fashion, chose this moment of escalating tension to host an event of immense social and political importance, the marriage of his son, Humphrey of Toron, to Princess Isabella, the young step-sister of King Baldwin IV. This was no simple ceremony. It was a gathering of the entire Frankish elite, a who's who of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, all gathered inside the walls of Saladin's most desired target. It was an unbelievable provocation, a display of arrogance that Saladin simply could not ignore. The news of this glittering assembly, isolated and vulnerable deep in enemy territory, reached Saladin like a gift. He saw an opportunity to achieve a victory of staggering proportions. He could potentially capture the entire Crusader nobility in a single stroke, decapitating the kingdom's leadership and ending the war in one brilliant siege. With incredible speed, he mobilized his army and descended upon Kerak, surrounding the castle and trapping its illustrious guests inside. The scene must have been one of surreal contrast. Inside the Great Hall, the nobility celebrated with feasting, music, and the pageantry of a high medieval wedding. Outside, the drums of war began to beat, and the first stones from Saladin's siege engines began to crash against the lower walls. The celebration had suddenly become a desperate fight for survival. What followed was a masterclass in the brutal, grinding reality of medieval siege warfare, but also in the powerful psychological forces that drove it. Saladin, determined to shatter the defenders' morale, concentrated his artillery fire on the specific tower where the wedding party was housed. Chronicles recount that as the newlyweds and their terrified guests huddled inside, massive stones slammed into the walls, shaking the very foundations. In a moment of dark humor that has echoed through history, it is said that Reynold himself, in a display of his characteristic bravado, sent messengers out to Saladin. They presented the Muslim leader with samples of the wedding feast, fine wine, and choice cuts of meat, asking if he might perhaps have a need for any of it to supply his army. The message was clear: we are so well provisioned and confident that we can even afford to feed you. It was a stunning act of psychological defiance, a calculated insult designed to enrage the besieger and bolster the courage of the besieged. Saladin's response was equally pointed. He reportedly asked in which tower the newly married couple were lodging, and then ordered his engineers to specifically avoid targeting it, declaring that he would not make a new bride a widow. This was not an act of mercy, but one of calculated chivalric theater. Saladin was a master of propaganda, and he understood the power of appearing magnanimous and honorable even in the midst of brutal warfare. This exchange highlights the complex, often contradictory code of conduct that existed even between bitter enemies, where personal honor and the rituals of aristocracy could sometimes momentarily override the sheer brutality of holy war. The siege dragged on for weeks, becoming a grueling test of endurance. The defenders, though trapped, were well supplied thanks to Kerak's vast storerooms and its ingenious internal well, which provided a constant source of water. They repelled assault after assault, their spirits oddly buoyed by the very drama of their situation. For Saladin, time was running out. The approaching winter and the knowledge that a Crusader relief army was being assembled in Jerusalem forced his hand. When news arrived that King Baldwin, despite his crippling leprosy, was personally leading a force to break the siege, Saladin made the difficult decision. He could not afford to be caught between the fortress walls and a relieving army. He ordered a withdrawal, burning his siege engines and camps in a final act of frustration as he retreated. Kerak had held, on the surface, the siege was a clear Crusader victory. They had held their ground and forced the great Saladin to retreat empty-handed. It was a tremendous boost to morale and a testament to the incredible defensive strength of their castles, but the victory was a Pyrrhic one. The resources expended in the defense were enormous. The constant need to raise relief armies drained the treasury and stretched the kingdom's already thin military manpower to its absolute limit. Most importantly, the siege cemented the deep, personal animosity between Raynald and Saladin. In the Muslim world, Raynald's survival and his blatant acts of defiance made him a symbol of Frankish perfidy, a man who had to be destroyed. For Saladin, the failure to take Kerak was a lesson he would not forget. It taught him that he could not defeat the Franks by besieging their mighty castles one by one. He needed to draw their entire army into the open field and destroy it in a single, decisive engagement. The Siege of Kerak, in all its dramatic glory, was the final rehearsal for the main event. It set the stage, built the tension, and foreshadowed the catastrophic defeat that would unfold just 4 years later on the dusty, waterless hills near the Horns of Hattin. Yet even as the Kingdom of Jerusalem celebrated its miraculous victory at Montezard and endured the dramatic siege of Kerak, a deep and poisonous rot was festering within its very leadership. The heroism of a leper king and the defiance of a mighty castle could not mask the bitter personal rivalries, reckless ambition, and catastrophic misjudgment that were about to culminate in a single, bloody afternoon of sheer folly. This is the story of the Battle of Crescent, a clash so small in scale yet so enormous in its consequences that it serves as the perfect, tragic prologue to the downfall of a kingdom. It was not a grand set-piece battle between armies, but a savage ambush born from arrogance, a devastating preview of the disaster that would echo through history just a few weeks later. The spark that ignited this powder keg was a matter of high-stakes diplomacy gone horribly wrong. In the early summer of 1187, Saladin, having learned from his previous failures, was meticulously assembling the largest army he had ever commanded. His goal was nothing less than the complete and final destruction of the Crusader States. As this vast force began to mobilize, a delegation from the mighty Crusader fortress of Kerak, led by the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Gerard de Riedfort, was traveling to meet with Saladin to negotiate a renewal of a fragile truce. They were accompanied by a contingent from the rival military order, the Knights Hospitaller, led by their Grand Master, Roger de Moulins. The negotiations, however, were a complete failure. Saladin, now confident in his overwhelming strength, saw no need for further diplomacy. He brusquely dismissed the Crusader envoys, and the two Grand Masters began their return journey, their mission a total failure. But their paths diverged. Roger de Moulins, a voice of caution and experience, turned south toward the safety of the fortress of Tiberias. Gerard de Riedfort, a man whose defining characteristic was a volatile mix of religious fanaticism and personal pride, turned north toward the Templar stronghold at Lafave. It was a decision that would split the leadership at the most critical possible moment. The very next day, Gerard de Riedfort, now at Lafave, received earth-shattering intelligence. A large Muslim raiding party, a detachment from Saladin's main army, had been spotted foraging near the springs of Cresson, perilously close to his position. The force was significant, but it was not Saladin's main host. To any prudent commander, the logical response would have been to gather intelligence, fortify positions, and wait for reinforcements. But Gerard de Riedfort was not a prudent man. He was a zealot who saw any Muslim force as an affront to God and an insult to his own honor. He immediately sent out a call to arms, not to form a large army, but to gather every available knight for an immediate, impulsive attack. The local Baron of Nazareth, a man named James of Mailly, who was the marshal of the kingdom and a seasoned warrior, heard the plan and was horrified. He pleaded with Gerard, urging caution. He pointed out that the Muslim force was far too large for the tiny contingent Gerard was assembling. He famously told the Grand Master that they would be rushing to their deaths and that he, James of Mailly, had no wish to be called a coward, but had even less wish to be remembered as a fool. Gerard's response was a masterpiece of toxic pride. He sneered at the marshal, accusing him of loving his blonde head too much to risk it in battle, and declared that he himself would attack even if he had to go alone. Shamed and bound by the codes of chivalry, the brave marshal reluctantly agreed to follow his reckless leader into the abyss. What followed was not a battle, but a meticulously planned slaughter. The Crusader force was tiny, a mix of Templar knights and local levies, perhaps 140 knights in total. They charged headlong toward the springs of Crescent, driven by fury and fanaticism, and straight into a trap. The raiding party was in fact a powerful vanguard of seasoned Ayyubid veterans, including some of Saladin's most elite troops. They were not foraging, they were waiting. The Muslim commander Muzaffar ad-Din Gurkbari, a general known for his skill and ferocity, had chosen his ground perfectly. As the outnumbered Franks charged, he feigned a retreat, drawing them into a killing zone. Then his hidden cavalry emerged from concealed positions, surrounding the Crusaders completely and cutting off any hope of escape. The Frankish knights, trapped and overwhelmed, were systematically annihilated. They fought with the desperation of doomed men, but their fate was sealed the moment Gerard gave the order to charge. The marshal, James of Mailly, lived up to his word, fighting heroically until he was cut down. Nearly the entire knightly contingent was massacred. Only 3 Templar knights, including Gerard de Riedfort himself, managed to cut their way out and escape the carnage. The Grand Master's survival, while his men died around him, added a bitter layer of irony to the tragedy. The immediate military loss was bad enough. The Kingdom of Jerusalem could ill afford to lose over 100 of its best-trained, heavily armored knights on the eve of a massive invasion. These were the professional core of its defense, the officers and veterans whose experience would be desperately needed in the coming weeks. But the political and psychological damage was infinitely worse. The disaster at Crescent poured gasoline on the already smoldering tensions within the Crusader High Command. It vindicated the peace party, led by Count Raymond Roman III of Tripoli, who had long advocated for caution and diplomacy with Saladin. It utterly discredited the hawks, like Reynold of Chatillon and now Gerard de Riedfort, whose reckless aggression had just gotten 100 good men killed for absolutely no gain. When the news reached the court of King Guy, it created an atmosphere of panic, blame, and paralyzing disunity. Gerard, humiliated and desperate to restore his shattered reputation, would become even more bellicose and aggressive, using his influence to push for the very same kind of rash, head-on confrontation that had just failed so spectacularly. The stage was now perfectly set. The Crusader leadership was divided, its field army was weakened, and its strategic judgment was clouded by grief, rage, and a desperate need for redemption. Just 1 month later, these same emotions would compel King Guy to ignore all sane military advice and march that weakened army out into the waterless hills of Hattin, leading them directly into Saladin's waiting trap. Cresson was the first deafening crack in the foundation, a small, violent preview of the total collapse that was to come. Yet while the reckless charge at Crescent had crippled the kingdom's knightly core, the full weight of Saladin's response was still gathering like a thunderhead on the horizon. His victory at Hattin and the subsequent capture of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Christendom, a clarion call that could not be ignored. The answer came not as a single army, but as a slow, grinding, and grueling convergence of forces on a single point on the coast, the formidable port city of Acre. Everyone knows the end of this story, the glorious arrival of kings, the legendary exploits of Richard the Lionheart, the final surrender. But what is almost always forgotten is the brutal 2-year prologue to that grand finale, a nightmare of attrition fought not by monarchs, but by a desperate, dying remnant of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and a steady trickle of European arrivals who threw themselves into a meat grinder of mud, disease, and relentless combat. This was the real Siege of Acre, a story not of chivalric glory, but of sheer, stubborn survival. The siege began not with a triumphant declaration, but with a fugitive's last stand. In the summer of 1189, Guy of Lusignan was a king in name only. His army had been destroyed at Hattin, his kingdom had been overrun, and he was recently released from Saladin's custody, a humiliated ruler with nothing left to lose. With a tiny force of perhaps several hundred men, he marched up the coast and did something that seemed like utter madness. He laid siege to Acre. The city was one of the greatest fortresses in the world, garrisoned by a vast Muslim force and supported by Saladin's field army, which was camped on the hills just outside, watching this absurd spectacle. Guy's audacity was not born of strength, but of absolute desperation. He set up his camp on a nearby hill, a pathetic-looking enclave that would become known as the root of all the suffering and heroism to come. For months, this was the reality of the Crusader effort, a fragile ring of besiegers who were themselves besieged by Saladin's relief force. They were trapped in a deadly no-man's land, caught between the massive walls of Acre and the encircling Muslim army, a situation that demanded a new kind of warfare, one of entrenched positions, constant vigilance, and a grim battle of supply lines. The true turning point wasn't the arrival of a king, but the arrival of a ship. The first significant break for Guy's desperate enterprise came not from a royal fleet, but from a squadron of 50 Danish and Frisian crusaders whose ships, blown off course, stumbled upon the siege. Seeing the dire situation, they didn't just disembark, they used their ships as a weapon. In a daring naval assault, they used their vessels' high decks as fighting platforms to storm and capture a key watchtower on the harbor walls, a vital foothold that for the first time gave the Crusaders a way into the city. This initial success sparked a slow-motion avalanche of reinforcements. Pisan fleets arrived, then contingents from France and Germany, not in organized armies but in a ragged, piecemeal stream. They didn't bring decisive victory, they simply fed men into the grinding machine. The siege lines solidified into 2 parallel rings of horror, an inner ring facing Acre's walls, and an outer ring of trenches and field fortifications facing outward to hold back Saladin's constant attacks. The Crusaders were both the anvil and the hammer, and they were being worn down by both. Life within these siege lines was a special kind of hell, a test of endurance that had little to do with knightly combat. The low-lying camps became a swamp of mud and human filth, a perfect breeding ground for disease. Typhoid, dysentery, and other camp fevers ravaged the ranks, claiming far more lives than Muslim arrows or swords. Food was perpetually scarce, and prices for even a moldy crust of bread became astronomical. The only thing in greater supply than misery was the sheer, mind-numbing boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. This was a war of sappers and engineers, an underground battle of tunnels and counter-tunnels where men fought and died in pitch darkness, listening for the telltale scrape of an enemy pickaxe, knowing that at any moment the ground could collapse or be set ablaze by Greek fire. It was a war of snipers and constant skirmishing where the only glory was surviving another day. For 2 long years, this was the reality. The names of the commanders who held this line, like the steadfast Conrad of Montferrat, who organized the defense with brilliant pragmatism, are often overshadowed by the kings who would later take the credit. But it was their leadership, their ability to maintain morale and discipline in a literal pit of despair, that kept the enterprise from collapsing entirely. They were the ones who won the war of attrition, who endured long enough for the glamorous finale to even be possible. The arrival of Philip Augustus of France and Richard the Lionheart in 1191 was the climax, but it was just that, an arrival. They walked onto a stage that had been built, paid for in blood and suffering, by thousands of forgotten men who had already done the hardest part of the work. The Siege of Acre was ultimately a victory of stubbornness over strategy, a testament to the fact that the most important battles are often won not by the brilliant charge, but by the simple, brutal refusal to give up. Yet even after the titanic struggle for Acre had finally concluded, the Third Crusade was far from over. The 2 greatest commanders of their age, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, remained locked in a grueling war of maneuver along the Palestinian coast, a tense game of strategic thrust and parry where every port city and fortress was a contested prize. Richard's grand strategic goal was clear: to recapture Jerusalem itself, the emotional and spiritual heart of the entire endeavor. But as the summer of 1192 wore on, that goal seemed to slip further from his grasp. His army was exhausted, riddled with disease, and bitterly divided by the political rivalries that had plagued the crusade from the start. Saladin, though also weary, knew that time was his ally. He shadowed the Crusader army, avoiding a decisive pitched battle while using his light cavalry to harass their supply lines and destroy the countryside, making a march inland toward Jerusalem an increasingly suicidal proposition. It was in this atmosphere of strategic frustration and simmering tension that Saladin saw an opportunity to deliver a masterstroke, one that he believed could end the crusade on his terms. He would launch a surprise attack to recapture the critical port city of Jaffa. If Jaffa fell, Richard's sole secure supply line from Cyprus and Europe would be severed, trapping the Crusader army on the coast and forcing its complete surrender. The stage was set for one final, dramatic clash that would defy all conventional military logic and become the ultimate testament to one man's battlefield brilliance. The attack began with stunning speed and success. On the 1st of August, Saladin's forces swept down on Jaffa. The city's walls, still damaged from previous fighting, were vulnerable, and its garrison was small and complacent. After a furious bombardment, Muslim sappers undermined a section of the fortifications, and their assault troops poured through the breach. The Frankish defenders, along with the Italian merchants and townspeople, were driven back in disarray, eventually making a last stand within the city's citadel. From their high walls, they could only watch in despair as Saladin's banners were raised over the town, his troops systematically securing every street and building. Messengers were desperately dispatched by sea, racing down the coast to find King Richard, who was camped near Caesarea. The news they brought was catastrophic. Jaffa had fallen, the army was cut off, and the entire crusade now hung by a thread. Most commanders faced with such a disaster would have considered withdrawal or opened negotiations for surrender. Richard's response was pure, unadulterated audacity. He immediately commandeered every available ship in the area, a motley collection of merchant vessels and war galleys, and without waiting to assemble his entire army, set sail with a tiny advance force of perhaps 80 knights, a few hundred crossbowmen, and his most loyal household warriors. He was going to attempt the impossible, an amphibious assault to retake a city that had already been conquered by a vastly superior enemy force. What happened next is the stuff of pure legend, a moment where history and myth beautifully converge. As Richard's small flotilla approached Jaffa's harbor, the scene before them was one of utter chaos. The citadel was still holding out, but Muslim flags flew from the walls and Saladin's troops were everywhere. Some accounts say that Richard, in his impatience, didn't even wait for his ships to properly beach. He leaped into the waist-deep water in full armor, roaring his famous war cry, and waded ashore, his men following close behind in a wave of sudden, shocking violence. The Muslim troops in the harbor area, who were busy looting and were completely unprepared for an attack from the sea, were thrown into instant panic. This was not part of any plan they had conceived. Richard and his small band fought their way through the streets toward the citadel, a spearhead of focused fury. Their sudden appearance was so unexpected and their assault so ferocious that they managed to punch a hole straight through the enemy lines, reaching the besieged garrison and lifting their spirits just as they were on the verge of collapse. In a single, breathtaking maneuver, Richard had re-established a foothold inside the city he had just lost. Saladin, watching from his camp outside the walls, was furious and incredulous. He had been on the cusp of total victory, and now this reckless Frankish king had snatched it from his grasp with what seemed like a handful of men. He ordered a full-scale counterattack the very next day, determined to crush this insolent incursion once and for all. What followed was not a battle of grand maneuvers, but a brutal, intimate fight for survival right on the beaches of Jaffa. Richard, ever the master of tactical improvisation, knew his tiny force could not withstand a conventional battle in the open. He formed them into a tightly packed, disciplined infantry square on the shore, with his knights and men at arms forming a shield wall on the outside, and his crossbowmen positioned in the center. He gave them a simple, devastating order. The crossbowmen were to fire in rotating volleys, maintaining a constant, withering hail of bolts, while the men in front were to stand firm and let nothing break their line. Richard himself, eschewing the aristocratic tradition of fighting on horseback, stood on foot in the front rank with a large pavai shield and a fearsome poleaxe, personally directing the defense and fighting like a common infantryman. The resulting battle was a brutal masterpiece of defensive warfare. Wave after wave of Saladin's best cavalry charged the seemingly fragile Crusader line, only to be met by that relentless storm of crossbow bolts that cut down horses and riders alike. Those who made it through the missile fire crashed against a wall of shields and were met by the lethal skill of Richard and his knights. The Lionheart was everywhere in the fray, a towering figure whose personal courage electrified his outnumbered soldiers. At one point, chroniclers claim, he even offered 1,000 gold pieces for anyone who could fetch him a spare crossbow from one of the ships, so intent was he on ensuring the barrage never ceased. For hours, this tiny band of Franks, with their backs to the sea, held off the entire army of Saladin. The Muslim attacks, though brave and persistent, eventually lost their momentum in the face of such disciplined and lethal resistance. The sheer impossibility of the situation, a king fighting on foot, a force outnumbered perhaps 50 to 1 refusing to yield, sapped the morale of Saladin's troops. By the end of the day, they withdrew, leaving the beach littered with their dead and wounded. Richard, against every odd, had won. The Battle of Jaffa was a tactical victory of the highest order, but its true importance was diplomatic. The sheer brilliance and bravery of Richard's performance created a powerful psychological shift. Saladin, a man who deeply respected martial prowess even in his enemies, was said to be in awe of the Lionheart's courage. More importantly, the battle convinced both men that they had reached a point of mutual exhaustion. Richard had proven he could win any battle, but he lacked the strength to march on and hold Jerusalem. Saladin had been thwarted at the very moment of his triumph and saw that he could not dislodge the Franks from the coast. This bloody stalemate on the beach at Jaffa became the catalyst for peace. Just weeks later, the two weary giants would agree to the Treaty of Ramla, also known as the Treaty of Jaffa. This agreement recognized the new reality Richard had forged with his sword. The Crusaders would retain a thin but vital coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, and Christian pilgrims would be guaranteed safe passage to visit Jerusalem. The Holy City would remain under Muslim control, but the Kingdom of Jerusalem, though shrunken, was reborn. The battle stands as a powerful reminder that in history, even when grand strategic objectives remain out of reach, the sheer force of individual will and action can still shape the world, carving out a fragile peace from the brink of total defeat. Yet, even as the Crusader States in the Holy Land fought for their survival, a disastrous and unintended consequence of the crusading spirit was unfolding over 1,000 miles to the northwest, in the rugged and politically treacherous landscape of the Balkans. The Fourth Crusade, which had infamously veered off course to sack the Christian city of Constantinople in 1204, had created a bizarre and fragile new entity, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. This was not a triumph of faith, but a monument to cynical realpolitik and brute force, a Frankish puppet state grafted onto the heart of the ancient Byzantine world. Its first emperor, Baldwin IV, Count of Flanders, now sat uneasily on a throne he had won by destroying a fellow Christian empire, his authority stretching thin over a population that viewed him and his Latin knights not as liberators but as heretical invaders. It was in this volatile atmosphere of resentment and fragile conquest that Emperor Baldwin I made a fateful decision to march out from his new capital and impose his will on the surrounding province of Thrace, a move that would lead directly to one of the most catastrophic and humiliating defeats in the entire history of the Crusades, the Battle of Adrianople. Baldwin's target was a rebellion stirred up by two Greek nobles in the city of Adrianople, a key strategic stronghold. To the new Latin emperor, this was a simple problem requiring a simple, forceful solution, a demonstration of Frankish military might to crush dissent before it could spread. He vastly underestimated his opponents. The rebellious Greeks had not simply decided to stand alone against the might of the Latin knights. They had sent a desperate plea for help to a powerful and cunning neighboring ruler who had been watching the Franks' arrival with deep alarm and keen interest, Tsar Kaloyan of Bulgaria. Kaloyan was a leader of immense ambition, presiding over a revitalized Bulgarian empire. He was a master of diplomacy who had skillfully played the great powers of the era, even receiving a royal crown from Pope Innocent III, which earned him the moniker Johannitsa, or John the Handsome. To Kaloyan, the Latin Crusaders were not holy warriors. They were dangerous interlopers, a new and aggressive power suddenly planted on his doorstep, threatening his own expansionist dreams. The Greek plea for aid was not a crisis, it was the perfect opportunity. He promised the rebels his full support, and then he began to carefully set a trap, mobilizing his army with a specific plan to counter the one overwhelming advantage the Crusaders always relied upon, the heavy cavalry charge. Emperor Baldwin, confident in the superiority of his armored knights, marched on Adrianople and laid siege to the city. He was soon informed that a large Bulgarian relief army was approaching. Instead of consolidating his position or retreating to a more favorable location, Baldwin, in a moment of reckless overconfidence that echoed the worst mistakes of the Crusader kings in the East, decided to abandon his siege lines and march out to meet Kaloyan in open battle. He believed a single, crushing charge would scatter what he viewed as an undisciplined force of Balkan tribesmen. On the 14th of April, 1205, the Latin army took the field. The Bulgarians, however, were ready for them. Kaloyan had arranged his forces with brilliant tactical foresight. He positioned his main body of troops behind a screen of light skirmishers, and most importantly, had prepared the battlefield itself. The ground was littered with hidden pits and stakes, and his plan relied on a classic steppe nomad strategy, the feigned retreat. The battle unfolded exactly as Kaloyan had envisioned. The Latin knights, seeing the Bulgarian skirmishers, launched their famed thunderous charge. The Bulgarians gave way before them, falling back in a seemingly disorganized rout. The excited knights, believing victory was already in their grasp, surged forward in pursuit, their discipline evaporating as they plunged headlong into the prepared killing zone. Their formation broke apart as they navigated the broken ground, and at that precise moment Kaloyan sprung his trap. Thousands of fresh Bulgarian cavalry, who had been held in reserve, emerged from concealed positions and slammed into the disorganized flanks of the Crusader army. At the same time, a force of over 14,000 light Cuman horse archers, fierce allies of the Bulgarians, enveloped the Franks, unleashing a relentless hail of arrows from all sides. The battle dissolved into a chaotic melee where the Crusaders' heavy armor became a death sentence, slowing them down and making them easy targets for the more mobile Bulgarian forces. It was a complete encirclement, a perfect ambush on a grand scale. The result was an unmitigated disaster for the Latin Empire. The Crusader army was annihilated. Count Louis of Blois, a key leader, was killed on the field. Most catastrophically, Emperor Baldwin himself was captured alive and taken away in chains as a prized prisoner of the Tsar. The fate of the Latin emperor remains one of history's grim mysteries. He was never seen again by Western sources. While the exact details of his death are shrouded in legend, some stories claim he was executed, others that he died in a dungeon. His capture was as effective as any death blow. The defeat at Adrianople was a political and military earthquake that shattered the illusion of Latin strength. The nascent Latin Empire of Constantinople, barely a year old, was suddenly decapitated and left reeling, its military power broken and its credibility destroyed. For Tsar Kaloyan, it was the crowning achievement of his reign. He sent boastful letters to the Pope and other Western rulers, detailing his victory and styling himself as the new scourge of the haughty Latins. The battle allowed him to expand Bulgarian influence dramatically, presenting himself as the protector of the Greek population against the Frankish invaders and permanently altering the balance of power in southeastern Europe. Adrianople stands as a stark and brutal lesson in the dangers of imperial overreach and cultural arrogance. It proved that the tactical playbook that worked in the Holy Land was useless in the complex political landscape of the Balkans, and that the greatest threats to a crusader often came not from the expected enemies of his faith, but from the unexpected, cunning kings who waited for him to make his first fatal mistake. While the disastrous defeat at Adrianople had shattered the ambitions of the Latin Empire far to the west, the core Crusader states in the Holy Land were experiencing a brief and deceptive Indian summer. A strange twist of geopolitics had handed them an unexpected reprieve. The sudden and terrifying arrival of the Mongols from the eastern steppes had sent shockwaves through the Islamic world, sacking Baghdad and shattering the power of the Abbasid Caliphate. This massive external threat forced the Ayyubid rulers of Egypt and Syria to look inward, temporarily pausing their relentless pressure on the Frankish holdings. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, now essentially reduced to a narrow coastal strip with its capital at Acre, this was a precious gift of time. They used it to rebuild, to refortify, and even to briefly reoccupy Jerusalem itself through a favorable treaty. There was a flicker of hope, a sense that perhaps the tide had finally turned. But this fragile peace was built on a foundation of sand, and in the autumn of 1244, that foundation was washed away in a single, bloody afternoon at a place called La Forbe, in a battle so catastrophic it would rightly be called the Second Hattin, a final, decisive blow from which the Crusader States would never truly recover. The catalyst for this disaster was not a king or a sultan, but the chaotic aftermath of the Mongol advance. As the Mongol hordes swept through Persia and Mesopotamia, they displaced a powerful and ferocious nomadic people known as the Khwarezmians. These were Turkish warriors from Central Asia, now rendered stateless, masterless, and desperate. They became the ultimate mercenaries, a brutal, mobile army of thousands of veteran horse archers and cavalrymen, selling their services to the highest bidder. They were a weapon without a master, a force of pure, destructive energy waiting to be aimed. The Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, as Salih Ayyub, saw in these desperate nomads the perfect tool to finally crush his Muslim rivals in Syria, and as a convenient bonus, annihilate the Crusader States in one fell swoop. He offered them wealth and land in exchange for their swords, and the Khwarezmians, with nothing left to lose, accepted. They surged into Palestine like a human tsunami, their first act a symbol of their terrifying purpose. They descended upon a vulnerable Jerusalem, which was under Christian control but lightly garrisoned. They sacked the holy city with a brutality that shocked even the hardened observers of the era, desecrating churches and massacring the population. This was not just a military action, it was a statement of intent. The Khwarezmians were now the spear point of Egypt, and they were pointed straight at the heart of what was left of the Crusader kingdom. Faced with this existential threat, the Crusaders did something that had become tragically rare. They united. The armies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the Knights Templar and Hospitaller joined forces with their recent enemies, the Ayyubid emirs of Damascus and Homs, who were equally terrified of both the Khwarezmians and their Egyptian patron. This Christian-Muslim alliance was a masterpiece of realpolitik, a recognition that their immediate survival depended on standing together. They assembled a massive combined host, one of the largest field armies ever put together by the Franks in the 13th century. On paper, it was a formidable force, a beacon of hope. They marched south to confront the Khwarezmian threat near the village of La Forbe, northeast of Gaza. Confidence was high, they had numbers, they had unity, and they had the moral certainty of facing a monstrous enemy. This confidence evaporated the moment the two armies faced each other on the field. The Crusader Damascene alliance was a patchwork force, a coalition of factions with different leaders, different tactics, and crucially, different levels of commitment. The Khwarezmian army, by contrast, was a single, homogeneous instrument of war, fanatically devoted to its commanders and expert in the lethal dance of steppe warfare. The battle began with the Khwarezmian horse archers doing what they did best. They swarmed around the flanks of the allied army, unleashing a ceaseless storm of arrows. They refused to close into a melee, instead whittling down the Crusader and Damascene ranks from a distance. The disciplined Frankish knights and men-at-arms held their formations, but their Ayyubid allies, whose lighter cavalry was suffering terribly under the arrow fire, began to waver. The crucial moment came when the Damascene troops, deciding that this was not their fight to die for, broke. Their entire contingent turned and fled the field in a panic, exposing the Crusaders' left flank completely. In an instant, a difficult battle became an inescapable trap. The Khwarezmians, seeing the gaping hole in the Allied line, surged into the breach. the Crusader army was now surrounded and isolated. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. The Frankish knights, dismounted and forming desperate defensive circles, were overwhelmed by the relentless attacks from all sides. They fought with the courage of doomed men, but their fate was sealed. The losses were staggering, on a scale not seen since the catastrophe at Hattin over half a century before. The entire military hierarchy of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was effectively wiped out. Hundreds of knights Templar and Hospitaller were killed, including their Grand Masters. The Marshal of the Templars was captured and executed on the spot. The army of Antioch was virtually annihilated, its power broken forever. In a single day, the Crusader States lost the last significant field army they would ever muster. The aftermath of La Forbe was a silent, hollow emptiness. There were no grand retreats, no heroic last stands. The military power of Outremer had been extinguished. The kingdom was reduced to a collection of fortified coastal cities, Acre, Tyre, Sidon, with no ability to project power beyond their walls. They became prisoners in their own castles, utterly dependent on sea power and sporadic reinforcements from Europe for their survival. The battle cleared the way for the rise of a new, even more formidable power, the Mamluks. The very same Egyptian regime that had hired the Khwarezmians would soon be overthrown by its own slave soldiers, who would create a military sultanate dedicated to the systematic eradication of the remaining Crusader outposts. La Forbe stands as a terrifying lesson in the unpredictability of history. The ultimate blow did not come from a long-standing rival, but from a displaced horde of nomads used as a temporary weapon by a cunning sultan. It demonstrated with brutal finality that in the struggle for the Holy Land, the Crusaders were not just players on the board. They could also become the pieces that were swept away when much larger forces decided to play their game. If the catastrophic defeat at La Forbe represented the final, shattering blow to the Crusaders' field strength, then the disastrous siege of Damascus 8 decades earlier stands as the original blueprint for how internal discord could unravel the most promising of campaigns from within. The Second Crusade was, in theory, Christendom's most powerful and unified response to the fall of the County of Edessa, a monumental undertaking blessed by the great preacher Bernard of Clairvaux and led by two of Europe's most powerful monarchs, the charismatic and pious King Louis VII of France and the formidable, pragmatic King Conrad III of Germany. This was not a ragged band of adventurers. It was a coordinated invasion by the heavyweights of medieval Europe, a veritable avalanche of steel and faith descending upon the Levant with the goal of striking a decisive blow against the rising power of Nur ad-Din. Their chosen target was not some minor outpost, but the jewel of Syria itself, Damascus, one of the oldest and most magnificent cities in the world, a political and economic hub whose capture would have reshaped the entire balance of power in the region. On paper, it was a flawless, overwhelming strategy. In reality, it became a masterclass in how petty greed, clashing egos, and disastrous diplomacy could turn certain victory into a humiliating farce. The problems began the moment the vast European armies arrived in the Holy Land. The local Crusader barons, particularly those from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, viewed the newcomers with a mixture of suspicion and condescension. These were men who had been born in the East, who had spent their lives navigating the complex web of Levantine politics, forging temporary alliances with Muslim emirs and understanding the delicate art of survival. To them, the European kings were bull-headed amateurs, brash and ignorant of the region's realities, whose sheer numbers and brute force approach threatened to upset a precarious status quo that many of the locals had learned to profit from. The king of Jerusalem at the time, Baldwin III, was a young man caught between these two powerful opposing forces. the overwhelming might of his European allies and the cynical experience of his own nobility. The initial plan was sound, a direct assault on Damascus from the west, where the city was famously surrounded by vast, irrigated orchards known as the al-Gauta. These orchards were not just gardens, they were a formidable natural defensive barrier, a dense, labyrinthine network of trees, vines, and irrigation canals that would channel any attacking army into narrow, easily defended paths. The Crusaders plunged into this green maze and, despite fierce resistance from the Damascene garrison, began to make painstaking progress. After days of brutal, close quarters fighting among the trees, they finally broke through into the open area right before the city's main western wall. They were now within striking distance. The defenders of Damascus were in a state of panic, and the city seemed on the verge of falling. It was at this moment of imminent victory that the entire campaign imploded. The local barons, led by figures with significant land claims and political interests in the region, suddenly intervened with a new and utterly baffling proposal. They argued that the Western approach was now untenable, that the walls were too strong and the casualties too high. They insisted the army abandon its hard-won positions and march around to the east side of the city, which they claimed was far less fortified and would be an easier point of attack. To the European kings, exhausted and reliant on their local guides, this seemed like sound military counsel. What they did not realize was that they were being manipulated in a breathtaking act of political sabotage. The eastern side of Damascus was, in fact, a barren, waterless plain with no cover whatsoever. More importantly, it was territory that held no strategic interest for the rival local barons, but was coveted by other Crusader lords who had proposed the move. The relocation was not a tactical adjustment. It was a move in a cynical chess game played by the local nobility for post-siege spoils, using the entire crusading army as their pawns. The order was given, and the Crusader host began its fateful march away from the walls they had nearly breached, around to the barren eastern side. The result was instantaneous catastrophe. By abandoning the orchards, they gave up their source of food, water, and timber for siege engines. Now exposed on a flat desert plain under the blistering summer sun, they found the eastern walls were not weaker at all. To make matters infinitely worse, Nur ad-Din, who had been rapidly marching to relieve the city, now arrived and easily cut off their retreat and their supply lines. The Crusaders found themselves trapped, thirsty, and starving, staring up at impossible walls while a powerful relief army closed in behind them. The atmosphere in the camp curdled from confusion to mutiny. The European kings finally understood they had been betrayed not by the enemy but by their own allies. Bitter arguments erupted between the French, the Germans, and the local barons, each faction blaming the others for the disastrous situation. With no other option, and just 4 days after their triumphant breakthrough in the orchards, the leaders made the shameful decision to retreat. The withdrawal quickly descended into a chaotic rout, as demoralized soldiers cast aside their armor and supplies in a desperate scramble to escape the advancing forces of Nur ad-Din, who harassed them all the way back to Crusader territory. The siege was over. The greatest army Europe had ever assembled had been defeated without ever fighting a major battle, undone by its own internal divisions. The repercussions of this fiasco were profound and far-reaching. For the Crusader States, it was a catastrophic waste of men, material, and, most importantly, political capital. The Second Crusade had not only failed, it had failed spectacularly and embarrassingly, shattering the myth of invincibility that had surrounded the European knights and making future calls for aid from the West much more difficult. The local barons may have won their petty political game, but in doing so, they had doomed their own kingdom to a future of isolation and weakness. For the Muslim world, and for Nur ad-Din in particular, the victory was a gift from heaven. The failure of such a powerful host was seen as clear divine favor, massively boosting Nur ad-Din's prestige and allowing him to position himself as the undisputed leader of the Muslim counter-crusade. He used this momentum to eventually seize control of Damascus itself, uniting Muslim Syria under his rule and creating the powerful, centralized state that would later be inherited and expanded by Saladin. The Siege of Damascus marked the definitive end of Crusader expansionism. After 1148, the grand strategy shifted permanently from one of conquest to one of sheer survival, a desperate holding action against a now unified and confident enemy. It stands as an eternal lesson that an army can often survive its enemies, but it cannot long survive the corrosive poison of its own internal strife and selfish ambition. While the disaster at La Forbe had shattered the military power of the inland Crusader States, a different kind of endgame was unfolding along the mountainous frontier between Syria and Armenia, where a lonely Templar fortress stood as a final sentinel against the rising tide of a new Islamic superpower. The year was 1266, and the world had changed utterly since the first optimistic days of the Crusades. The once formidable Crusader states were now reduced to a handful of coastal enclaves, and the dynamic new Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, under the brilliant and ruthless leadership of Sultan Baybars, was systematically mopping up the last remnants of Christian resistance. His strategy was meticulous and brutal: isolate the remaining strongholds, conquer them one by one, and erase the Frankish presence from the map forever. His next target was not a kingdom or a city, but a single, stubborn castle guarding a crucial mountain pass, Bagras. The struggle for this remote fortress would become a powerful symbol of the entire era's tragic conclusion, a story not of dramatic last stands, but of a slow, grinding, and inevitable extinguishing of light. Bagras, also known as Gaston to the Franks, was more than just a castle. It was a vital nerve center. Perched high in the Amanus Mountains, it controlled the strategic Syrian Gates Pass, a key route connecting the Mediterranean port of Alexandretta to the interior of Syria and the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. For the Knights Templar, who had held it for over a century, it was a crucial link in their defensive network, a base for operations, and a symbol of their enduring presence. For Baybars, it was an irritating obstacle, a dagger pointed at the supply lines of his expanding empire. Its capture would secure his northern flank and open the door for a full-scale invasion of Christian Armenia, the last independent Christian power in the region. The siege he laid was not a reckless assault, but a clinical demonstration of the Mamluks' evolved military science. Baybars had learned from previous failures against Crusader castles. He understood that to break these stone monsters, you needed more than courage. You needed engineers, patience, and a deep understanding of siegecraft. The Mamluks did not simply throw waves of soldiers at the walls of Bagras. Instead, they applied a methodical and terrifying pressure. Their arsenal included massive counterweight trebuchets, engines of war that could hurl enormous stones day and night to demoralize the defenders and weaken the fortifications. Teams of sappers, protected by mobile shelters, would dig tunnels beneath the walls to undermine them, setting fire to the wooden supports to collapse entire sections. This was warfare waged by calculation and physics, a stark contrast to the fiery charges of earlier eras. Inside the castle, the Templar garrison, though massively outnumbered, would have fought with the grim determination they were famous for. They would have patched breaches with timber and rubble, launched sorties to destroy siege engines, and endured the constant psychological torment of the bombardment. They were not just fighting for a castle, they were fighting for their order's honor and for the very idea of their continued existence in the Holy Land. But willpower alone could not hold back the inevitable. The Templars at Bagras were isolated. No relief army was coming from the shrunken kingdom of Jerusalem or from a preoccupied Armenia. They were on their own, facing the full, focused might of the Islamic world's most effective military machine. After a fierce and undoubtedly heroic defense, the fortress finally fell. The details of its capture are lost, but the outcome is clear. The Templar garrison was overcome, and the banner of the Mamluks was raised over the towers of Bagras. This was not a momentary setback, it was a permanent loss. Baybars, in a signature move, immediately refortified and regarrisoned the castle, turning the Templars' own stronghold into a Mamluk bulwark. The fall of Bagras sent shockwaves through the region far greater than its size would suggest. It was a clear signal that the Mamluks could now take any Crusader castle, no matter how formidable its reputation or location. It severed the land connection between the Crusader remnants and the Armenian kingdom, effectively isolating both and making each vulnerable to being defeated in detail. For the Knights Templar, it was the loss of a key strategic asset and a deep spiritual blow. Most importantly, it demonstrated a painful new reality. Individual heroism and tactical brilliance were no longer enough. The technological, numerical, and strategic advantages of the Mamluks had become overwhelming. The battle for Bagras was a microcosm of the entire late Crusader period, a slow-motion collapse where each lost castle, each fallen knight, was another step on a predetermined path to the end. It proved that history's tide could not be held back by the strength of a single order of warrior monks, no matter how brave their stand. While the grim struggle for survival played out in the fortresses of the Holy Land, the fate of the Crusader cause was often decided not in the deserts of Palestine, but in the glittering courts and choppy waters of Europe itself. The island of Sicily was the greatest prize in the Mediterranean, a lush, wealthy kingdom that served as the breadbasket and primary naval base for any serious campaign in the east. Whoever controlled Sicily controlled the sea lanes to Acre and the flow of knights, supplies, and silver that were the literal lifeblood of the Crusader States. In 1266, the question of who would command this vital resource was settled not in a holy war against Islam, but in a brutal, messy civil war between two rival Christian dynasties, a conflict that culminated in a fierce naval clash off the northwestern coast of Sicily near the city of Trapani. This battle, fought between the fleets of Charles of Anjou and the Aragonese forces supporting the last heirs of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, would have repercussions that echoed all the way to the walls of Jerusalem, demonstrating a painful truth for the Crusaders. Their survival often depended on the whims of European kings whose personal ambitions far outweighed any pious concern for the Holy Land. The background to this conflict was a tangled web of papal politics, imperial ambition, and dynastic rivalry. The Pope, seeking to rid Italy and Sicily of the troublesome Hohenstaufen emperors, had declared their line deposed and offered the crown of Sicily to Charles of Anjou, the ambitious younger brother of the King of France. Charles was a man of immense drive and ruthlessness, and he accepted the offer with a clear vision of building a vast Mediterranean empire of his own. To secure his prize, he had to defeat the last Hohenstaufen claimant, the 16-year-old Conradin, and his allies, which included the powerful King Peter III of Aragon, who had his own claims to the island through his wife. The stage was set for a war that would pit the French Angevin forces against a coalition of Aragonese, Sicilian, and Italian Ghibelline supporters. The sea, as always, was the key to victory. Control of the waters around Sicily meant control of the island itself, the ability to land armies and strangle enemy supply lines. Both sides knew that the war would be won or lost with their fleets. The two armadas that met off Trapani in that fateful year were among the most powerful ever assembled in the medieval Mediterranean. The Angevin fleet, commanded by Charles's trusted admirals, was a formidable force of galleys from Provence and Genoa, packed with experienced French knights and crossbowmen. Arrayed against them was the Aragonese fleet, a battle-hardened force of Catalan and Sicilian vessels, their crews veterans of countless raids and naval engagements. As the fleets closed in, the standard tactic of the era was to grapple and board, turning a sea battle into a land battle on floating wooden platforms. But what happened at Trapani was a masterstroke of psychological warfare and tactical deception that would decide the outcome without a single blow being struck. According to the chronicles, as the two fleets drew into battle formation, the Aragonese commanders realized they were significantly outnumbered and outpositioned. In a moment of incredible audacity, they ordered their entire fleet to feign a state of complete disarray and panic. Oars were shipped erratically, sails were loosened to flap in the wind, and the formation deliberately broke apart, giving the unmistakable impression of a fleet that had lost its nerve and was trying to flee in terror before the battle had even begun. The Angevin commanders, seeing what they believed to be a demoralized and broken enemy surging forward for what they thought would be an easy victory, they abandoned their own tight defensive formation and charged headlong into the apparent chaos, each ship eager to claim glory and prizes. This was exactly the reaction the Aragonese had hoped for. As the Angevin line stretched and lost its cohesion in the reckless pursuit, the Aragonese admiral gave a signal. Instantly, the feigned panic ceased. Trumpets blared, oars bit into the water in perfect unison, and the seemingly fleeing ships wheeled around with deadly purpose, reforming into a tight, disciplined line of battle. They had turned the tables completely. Now it was the Angevin fleet that was strung out, disorganized, and vulnerable. The Aragonese galleys, fighting with the fury of men who had just turned certain defeat into certain victory, slammed into the scattered Angevin vessels. The fighting was fierce, but the advantage lay entirely with the cohesive Aragonese force. Ship after Angevin ship was surrounded, boarded, and captured. The sea turned red and the defeat was total. The Angevin fleet was effectively destroyed, and with it, Charles of Anjou's immediate hopes of a quick victory. In the grand scheme of European politics, the Aragonese victory at Trapani was a temporary setback for Charles. He would eventually win the war on land, solidify his rule, and establish a powerful Angevin kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily. But the real, lasting casualty of this internal European squabble was the Crusader cause in the East. Charles of Anjou's entire focus and the vast resources of his new kingdom were now laser-focused on one objective: consolidating his power in the Mediterranean and defending it against his Aragonese and Byzantine rivals. The dream of a new crusade, of sending the knights and treasure of Sicily to reinforce the crumbling walls of Acre, evaporated completely. The kingdom of Jerusalem, which had looked to Charles as a potential savior, was now just a peripheral concern, a distant problem that would have to wait. The Battle of Trapani is a perfect, if tragic, illustration of a central theme in the later Crusades. The cause of the Holy Land was repeatedly sacrificed on the altar of European dynastic politics. The ships that burned off the coast of Sicily were not just warships, they were the potential lifeline for a dying kingdom, a lifeline that was severed because the kings of Europe were too busy fighting each other to remember why they had gone to the east in the first place. If the Fall of Bagras had demonstrated the Mamluks' mastery of the physical art of siegecraft, the capture of the Templar fortress of Safed just a few months later would reveal an even more terrifying dimension of their strategy, a deep, psychological understanding of how to break not just walls but the human spirit itself. Safed was not just another castle, It was a spiritual and strategic linchpin for the dying Crusader cause. Perched high in the hills of Galilee, it was one of the largest and most modern Templar strongholds, a formidable complex that dominated the surrounding countryside and served as a crucial watchtower overlooking the routes between the coastal capital of Acre and the interior. For Sultan Baybars, the Panther of Egypt, its capture was an absolute priority. Taking it would not only eliminate a nest of the feared Templar knights, but would completely sever the inland connection for the Franks, turning Acre into an isolated coastal enclave, utterly dependent on the sea for survival. The siege he laid in 1266 was a chillingly comprehensive operation, a blueprint for the methodical eradication of the Crusader presence that would rely as much on cunning and deceit as on brute force. Baybars approached Safed not as a blunt instrument but as a master surgeon. He knew its walls were strong, its garrison fanatical. A direct assault would be costly, perhaps even futile. Instead, he initiated a multi-pronged strategy designed to overwhelm the defenders physically and mentally. The first phase was a classic application of the Mamluk military reforms he had championed. His engineers erected massive counterweight trebuchets, colossal engines that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds with terrifying accuracy, day and night, to pound the walls and shatter the nerves of those inside. Simultaneously, teams of sappers protected by heavy wooden mantlets began the painstaking and dangerous work of digging mines beneath the fortress's towers. The goal was to tunnel under the foundations, shore up the excavations with wooden beams, and then set the supports ablaze, collapsing the tunnels and bringing the stonework above crashing down in a heap of rubble. This constant subterranean threat meant the defenders could never feel safe, even within the heart of their own castle. The very ground beneath their feet could literally give way at any moment. Yet Baybars's most devastating weapon was not launched from a trebuchet or dug from a mine. It was a weapon of words, a campaign of psychological warfare of a sophistication rarely seen in medieval conflict. As the bombardment and mining wore down the garrison's physical endurance, Baybars began a targeted propaganda effort aimed at the non-knightly elements within the castle's population. Safed, like all Crusader strongholds, was not defended solely by the Templar Brother Knights. Its walls were manned by a mixed force that included local Turcopoles, light cavalry often recruited from native Christians or converted Muslims, as well as Syrian Christian levies and civilian non-combatants. Baybars understood the inherent tensions within this diverse group. Through messengers and perhaps even by having his imams speak to the defenders from just beyond arrow range, he began to drive a wedge between them. He directed his promises specifically at the local troops and civilians, offering them generous terms. If they would surrender the castle, they would be granted full amnesty, safe passage, and even rewards. To the Templars, he offered nothing but the sword, knowing their fanatical code would never allow them to surrender. The effect was as calculated as it was destructive. Inside the beleaguered fortress, suspicion and fear began to fester. The local defenders, seeing the hopelessness of their situation and tempted by the promise of life and safety, started to question the wisdom of dying for the cause of a handful of Frankish knights who seemed willing to sacrifice them all for a lost battle. Whispers of betrayal circulated. The unity of the garrison, the single most important asset in any siege, began to crumble from within. Eventually, a delegation from inside the castle, likely representing the non-Templar soldiers, parleyed with Baybars. The Sultan, with all the gravity and authority of a mighty ruler, reaffirmed his oath. He swore on the Quran, the most binding oath a Muslim ruler could make, to honor the terms of safe passage. Convinced by this solemn pledge, the defenders agreed to surrender. The gates were opened. What followed was an act of breathtaking treachery that would cement Baybars's reputation for ruthlessness. The moment the Mamluk troops secured the fortress, the Sultan's promises evaporated. The Templar Knights, as expected, were immediately executed, but then Baybars turned on the very men who had accepted his offer. The local soldiers and civilians who had surrendered were rounded up. The safe passage they were promised led not to freedom, but to the slave markets of Cairo, or, for many, to the edge of a sword. The entire garrison was wiped out. This was not a spontaneous act of bloodlust, it was a cold, calculated policy. Baybars understood that mercy could be seen as weakness, and that a reputation for utter ruthlessness was a strategic asset in itself. The message he sent by breaking his oath at Safed was heard loud and clear by every other Crusader garrison in the Holy Land. Surrender was not an option. Resistance meant death, but so did capitulation. The only hope was to hold out for a relief that would never come, a strategy that would inevitably lead to their destruction anyway. The fall of Safed was a catastrophe from which the Crusader States never recovered. The loss of this key inland fortress turned the Christian presence in Palestine into a hollow coastal shell. The vital land bridge to the interior was permanently severed, isolating Acre and making it impossible to project power beyond the shoreline. But more than that, the fall of Safed broke something in the spirit of the remaining Franks. Baybars had shown that he was more than just a great military commander. He was a master of the human heart, capable of exploiting fear, hope, and division to achieve his goals. He had combined cutting-edge siege technology with ancient tricks of betrayal to create a formula for conquest that was both brutally efficient and terrifyingly effective. The siege stands as a dark testament to the idea that in war, the most powerful siege engine is not made of wood and rope, but of promises that are meant to be broken. For decades, a tantalizing dream had flickered in the minds of Crusader strategists, a grand alliance with a mysterious, invincible power from the distant east that would crush their Muslim enemies between two mighty hammers. This was the dream of a Christian-Mongol partnership. The Mongols, who had exploded out of Central Asia to create the largest contiguous land empire in history, were not Muslims. Many were Nestorian Christians or shamanists, and they held a deep-seated animosity towards the Islamic caliphates, which they had already toppled with the savage sack of Baghdad. To the desperate Crusaders clinging to their last coastal strips in Acre and Tripoli, the Mongols appeared as potential saviors, a divine instrument sent to smite the Mamluk Sultanate. By the close of the 13th century, this dream seemed on the cusp of reality. The Ilkhanate of Persia, a Mongol state ruled by the convert to Buddhism, Mahmud Ghazan, had repeatedly sent embassies to Europe proposing a joint military operation against the Mamluks. In the autumn of 1299, this proposed alliance finally moved from diplomacy to the battlefield, culminating in a fateful encounter in the valley of Wadi al-Kosnodar in Syria. This was the moment of truth, a last desperate roll of the dice for the very concept of outre-mer. The campaign began with stunning promise. Ghazan, a shrewd and capable leader, launched a full-scale invasion of Mamluk Syria. His army was a classic Mongol force, a vast, fast-moving host of incredibly disciplined horse archers, renowned for their ability to maneuver on the battlefield with a precision that made European knights seem clumsy and amateurish. They swept through the Syrian frontier, and true to his word, Ghazan sent messengers to the Crusader stronghold of Acre, urging his potential allies to march out and join him, to provide the heavy infantry needed to complement his mobile cavalry and to share in the spoils of a reconquered Holy Land. The King of Cyprus, Henry II, who was also the nominal king of Jerusalem, received the call. He was cautious, but the Templars and Hospitallers, along with a contingent of knights from Acre, decided to answer. They assembled a small but potent force and moved inland to link up with their unlikely new allies. For a brief, glorious moment, the dream was alive. The cross and the Mongol standard flew side by side. The two armies converged near the town of Homs and found the Mamluk host under Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad waiting for them. The Battle of Wadi al-Kosnodar that followed was a chaotic, sprawling affair, but its outcome hinged on the very cultural and strategic divides that had always made the alliance so fragile. The Mongols fought as they always had, using feigned retreats and waves of arrows to break the enemy formation. The Crusader contingent, however, found itself completely out of its element. They were accustomed to either defending stout walls or making decisive heavy cavalry charges against a defined enemy line. Here, on a vast open plain, the battle was a swirling, unpredictable maelstrom. The Mongols did not fight in a way that allowed for a coordinated Frankish charge. Their tactics were fluid, requiring a level of trust and implicit understanding that simply did not exist between the two forces. They were allies in name only, fighting two separate battles on the same field, unable to synchronize their efforts. This fundamental disconnect was ruthlessly exploited by the Mamluks. They were not the disorganized force the Mongols had faced decades earlier. They were now a professional military caste, bred for war and highly adaptable. They understood the Mongol tactics and had developed their own counter-strategies. More importantly, they fought with the unified purpose of defenders of their homeland, while the alliance against them was a marriage of sheer convenience. The battle raged for hours, but the crucial moment came when the Mamluk center, after absorbing the initial Mongol attacks, launched a powerful counterpunch. The Mongols, according to their custom, began to wheel away to regroup, a standard tactical maneuver for them. To the Crusaders, however, it looked like a full-scale rout. Isolated and believing their allies had abandoned them, the Frankish knights found themselves surrounded and cut off. They fought with their customary bravery, but they were overwhelmed. The Mongol army, seeing the Crusader contingent being annihilated and perhaps deciding the cost of the alliance was too high, disengaged from the battle and withdrew from the field in good order, leaving their would-be partners to their fate. The defeat at Wadi al-Kosnodar was far more than a lost battle. It was the shattering of a decades-long dream. The mangled bodies of Frankish knights left on the Syrian plain were the final, grim proof that the great Christian-Mongol alliance was a fantasy. The cultural chasm, the mutual suspicion, and the utterly incompatible ways of waging war had doomed it from the start. For the Mongols, it was a setback, one of many in their long rivalry with the Mamluks. For the Crusader States, it was the end of hope. There would be no powerful foreign savior. The defeat removed the last significant external threat to the Mamluk Sultanate, allowing them to consolidate their power and turn their full, undivided attention to the final eradication of the Crusader presence. The last remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, now utterly alone and devoid of any prospect of relief, could only watch and wait as the Mamluk storm gathered for its final, decisive blow. Wadi al-Kosnodar stands as one of history's great poignant what-ifs, a haunting reminder of how different the world might have been if trust and shared purpose had bridged the vast divide between steppe and citadel. Far from the dusty battlefields of the Holy Land, on a sun-baked plateau in the heart of Spain, a clash of civilizations was brewing that would send shockwaves all the way to the walls of Jerusalem. The year was 1212, and the Iberian Peninsula had been a stage for centuries of conflict known as the Reconquista, the slow, grinding Christian reconquest of lands held by Muslim powers. But this was not just another regional skirmish. A new and zealous Islamic force, the Almohad Caliphate, had crossed over from North Africa, unifying Al-Andalus under its fundamentalist rule and halting the Christian advance in its tracks. The Almohad ruler, Caliph al-Nasir, assembled a colossal army, one of the largest ever seen in the region, with a clear goal: to crush the Christian kingdoms of Spain once and for all and reverse the tide of the Reconquista. In response, Pope Innocent III declared this struggle a crusade, offering the same spiritual rewards to those who fought in Spain as to those who journeyed to the Holy Land. This call to arms drew knights not only from Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, but also from across the Pyrenees, creating a true international crusading army, united under the charismatic King Alfonso VIII of Castile. The two colossal forces converged at a place called Los Navas de Tolosa, setting the scene for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the entire Iberian Peninsula. The battle itself was a masterpiece of strategy and sheer desperation. The Christian army, though outnumbered, used the rugged terrain to its advantage. Forced through a narrow mountain pass defended by Almohad outposts, their vanguard fought a brutal delaying action that allowed the main force to deploy on the plateau beyond. On the morning of July 16th, the two armies faced each other across the field. The Almohad host was a breathtaking sight, a sea of men and banners that seemed to stretch to the horizon, their ranks filled with fierce North African Berber warriors and Andalusian cavalry. The Christian commanders, knowing a direct assault against such numbers could be suicidal, pinned their hopes on a risky plan. As the battle lines engaged, a small contingent of local shepherds, who knew the landscape intimately, guided a force of knights on a daring flanking maneuver through a hidden path in the hills. They emerged directly on the flank of the Almohad army, striking at the very heart of their command structure. The shock of this sudden attack from an unexpected direction caused panic to ripple through the Muslim ranks. The Christian main force, seeing the disruption, launched a massive, coordinated charge. The Almohad lines, caught between the hammer and the anvil, began to waver and then completely shattered. The defeat was total and catastrophic for the Almohads. Caliph al-Nasir himself barely escaped the field, and his army was virtually annihilated, breaking the power of the Almohad Caliphate in Spain forever. While this victory permanently shifted the balance of power on the Iberian Peninsula, its impact was felt like a distant tremor hundreds of miles away in the Levant. The Almohad Caliphate was not an isolated entity. It was part of the broader Islamic world, and its resources and attention were now intensely focused on its own survival in the West. The sheer scale of the defeat meant that no reinforcements, no financial support, and no political attention would be flowing from North Africa or Spain to aid the Ayyubid dynasties fighting the Crusaders in Syria and Egypt. It was a massive diversion of Muslim strength, creating a crucial window of opportunity for the beleaguered Crusader States. News of the stunning Christian victory at Los Navas de Tolosa traveled quickly along trade routes to the east, carried by merchants and pilgrims. For the Franks clinging to their coastal fortresses in Acre and Tyre, this news was a powerful shot of adrenaline, a potent symbol that the tide of holy war could still turn in their favor. It proved that a seemingly invincible Muslim army could be defeated decisively on the open field, a psychological boost that was as valuable as any shipment of weapons or knights. The battle stands as a powerful testament to the interconnected nature of the medieval world, where a triumph in the mountains of Spain could indirectly grant a breath of life to a kingdom in Palestine, reminding us that the Crusades were never a single conflict, but a global phenomenon of clashing faiths and empires. While the Crusader states in the Holy Land were grappling with the aftermath of Forbe and the rise of the Mamluks, a very different kind of holy war was reaching its climax on the frozen edges of Christendom, far to the north and east. This was the Northern Crusades, a centuries-long campaign not to reclaim Jerusalem, but to forcibly convert the pagan tribes of the Baltic region and subjugate the Orthodox Christian powers of Russia. Spearheading this effort were the Teutonic Knights, a military order originally founded in the Holy Land that had shifted its entire focus to carving out a vast theocratic state on the shores of the Baltic Sea. By the winter of 1242, their relentless drive eastward had brought them into a direct and violent confrontation with the powerful merchant republic of Novgorod, a clash of faiths and empires that would be decided not on a dusty plain, but on the eerily smooth, wind-scoured surface of a frozen lake. The mastermind of the Novgorodian defense was a young prince named Alexander Yaroslavich, who would later be immortalized by history as Alexander Nevsky, a name taken from his famous victory on the Neva River. The Teutonic Knights, along with their allies from Denmark and the crusading Bishop of Dorpat, saw Novgorod as the final obstacle to their complete domination of the region. They invaded Russian territory, capturing key outposts and pushing deep toward the city itself. Prince Alexander, a brilliant and charismatic commander, knew he could not defeat the heavily armored German knights in a straightforward, head-on battle on open ground. Instead, he chose his battlefield with cunning precision, the vast, frozen expanse of Lake Peipus. This was a surface the Teutonic Knights could cross, but one where their greatest strength, the devastating charge of their cloaked knights, would become a potentially fatal weakness. As the Teutonic force, a formidable column of perhaps 2,000 men including heavily armored knights, Danish infantry, and local Estonian auxiliaries, marched out onto the ice in their characteristic wedge formation known as the Boar's Head, they believed they were pursuing a retreating and disorganized enemy. This was exactly the illusion Alexander had worked to create. He had drawn them onto the lake, a seemingly open field that was, in reality, a perfectly designed trap. His own army, a mix of his personal Druzhina Guard, Novgorodian militia, and irregular light infantry, was not fleeing. They were waiting, arrayed on the eastern shore with the low, rising sun at their backs, ready to receive the charge. The German knights, confident in their invincibility, lowered their lances and began their thunderous advance across the ice, their horses' hooves sending chips of frozen spray into the air. The initial impact was brutal. The Crusader charge crashed into the center of the Russian lines, and for a moment, it seemed the sheer weight of their assault would cleave Alexander's army in two. But the Russian infantry, densely packed and fighting with long spears and axes, held their ground with desperate determination. They had been ordered to target the knights' horses, and as the magnificent war horses began to fall, screaming and thrashing on the ice, the momentum of the charge stalled. The battle dissolved into a chaotic, grinding melee all across the frozen lake. This is where Alexander's strategy came to fruition. The ice, though thick enough to hold men, began to crack and groan under the immense concentrated weight of the fully armored knights and their falling steeds. The Teutonic formation, so powerful in its initial thrust, now became a confused and struggling mass, their mobility completely nullified. At the critical moment, Alexander unleashed his masterstroke. From concealed positions on the flanks, his elite cavalry, his personal guard, swept around the struggling Crusader mass and slammed into their rear and sides. The Teutonic army was now completely surrounded on the ice, pressed in from all sides by an enemy that knew the terrain intimately. The Estonian auxiliaries, seeing the tide turn, were the first to break and flee, further spreading panic. The heavily armored knights, exhausted and trapped, found themselves unable to maneuver or retreat. The ice, now slick with blood, became a death trap. Chronicles describe knights and their horses crashing through the weakened ice into the freezing water below, dragged down by the immense weight of their plate armor. It was a rout of catastrophic proportions. The Teutonic knights and their allies were annihilated, with hundreds killed or captured. The Battle of Lake Peipus, also known as the Battle on the Ice, was a strategic earthquake that permanently halted the eastward expansion of the Teutonic Knights. It secured the independence of Novgorod and the other Russian principalities from German crusading efforts for centuries to come, but its impact resonated far beyond the Baltic. For the broader Crusader movement, it was a stark and costly diversion. The men, money, and material poured into the Northern Crusades by the papacy and noble families across Germany were resources that were desperately needed to shore up the defenses of the Holy Land. Every knight who died on the ice of Lake Peipus was a knight who would never stand on the walls of Acre. The defeat served as a painful lesson in the perils of overextension and fighting in unforgiving terrain against a determined and brilliantly led local resistance, a lesson that echoed the struggles in the mountains of Syria and the deserts of Palestine. It stands as a powerful reminder that the Crusades were never a monolithic war for Jerusalem, but a sprawling, multifaceted conflict that drained the strength of medieval Europe on multiple fronts, often to the ultimate detriment of its original and most famous goal. While the titanic clash at Los Navas de Tolosa would define the future of Spain, another crucial, though often overlooked, engagement was unfolding just 2 years earlier along the frontier of the Crown of Aragon, a siege that perfectly encapsulates the unique character of the Iberian Crusades. This was not a war of pure annihilation, but a complex, centuries-long process of reconquest and assimilation known as the Reconquista, and the siege of the Moorish fortress of Al-Damis in 1210 is a brilliant case study in its mechanics. King Peter II of Aragon, a ruler as pious as he was pragmatic, laid siege to this formidable stronghold not merely as an act of religious fervor, but as a calculated move to secure his southern borders and push the frontier of Christendom ever further. The castle itself was a classic example of Islamic military architecture, perched on a commanding height with daunting walls that seemed to defy any direct assault. A simple, brute force attack would have been disastrously costly. Instead, what followed was a masterclass in the blended warfare that had evolved on the peninsula, a fusion of Christian determination and borrowed Eastern ingenuity. The key to Peter's success lay in his embrace of the very military technology his enemies had perfected. The most feared weapon in any medieval siege was the trebuchet, and the most advanced designs of the era came from the Islamic world. Peter's army employed these massive counterweight engines, likely built with the help of experienced military engineers who understood the principles of physics and leverage needed to hurl massive stones with devastating accuracy. Day and night, these engines would have bombarded Al-Damis's walls, not just to breach them, but to terrorize the defenders and demoralize them through sheer, relentless force. Alongside this artillery barrage, the Aragonese forces would have used more intimate and terrifying tactics, sapping or mining. Teams of specialists protected by wooden shelters called vines or cats would dig tunnels beneath the fortress walls, shoring them up with timber beams. Once the tunnel was deep enough, they would set the wood ablaze, collapsing the tunnel and bringing a section of the wall above crashing down in a heap of rubble. This combination of long-range bombardment and subterranean attack showcased a level of military sophistication that the Franks in the Holy Land were only beginning to grasp. But the true lesson of Al-Damis and of the Reconquista as a whole extends far beyond the battlefield. The aftermath of the siege was not the wholesale slaughter or expulsion that sometimes characterized conflicts in the East. Once the fortress fell, King Peter faced a critical decision: what to do with the land and its people. His solution was one of practical colonization. He immediately issued a charter known as a Carta Publa, which offered generous terms to Christian settlers from the north to come down and repopulate the conquered territory. They were granted land, rights, and self-governance in exchange for their pledge to defend this new frontier. This policy of repopulation was the engine of the Reconquista, steadily moving the cultural and political border southward. Crucially, the Muslim population that remained was often allowed to stay under a status known as mudajar, permitted to practice their religion and govern their own communities in exchange for loyalty and a special tax. This created a society that was, for centuries, a fascinating mosaic of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures living in tense but often productive proximity. The victory at Al-Damis, therefore, was a double triumph. Militarily, it provided the Aragonese crown with a vital stronghold and a blueprint for future sieges. The techniques of sapping and the use of heavy siege artillery, honed on the battlefields of Spain, would be carried east by knights and military orders who traveled to the Holy Land, cross-pollinating Crusader tactics with Iberian innovation. Politically and culturally, it demonstrated a model of conquest that was as much about building as it was about breaking. It showed that a holy war could be followed by a pragmatic peace, where the victors absorbed not just the land, but also elements of the conquered culture's architecture, science, and agriculture. This complex interplay of violence and assimilation made the Iberian experience unique, proving that the tides of crusade could flow in more than one direction, each wave leaving a distinct and permanent mark on the shore. Yet even as the last echoes of the Crusader era faded in the Holy Land with the fall of Acre, the ideals of holy war found a new, terrifyingly modern enemy on a different frontier. The year was 1396, and the greatest threat to Christendom was no longer a sultan in Cairo or Damascus, but a dynamic and expanding Ottoman Empire, whose armies were steadily pushing into the very heart of Europe from their footholds in the Balkans. The Battle of Nicopolis was not a desperate defense of a distant outpost. It was a last grandiose gasp of the old crusading spirit, a colossal assembly of European chivalry that marched east not to reclaim a tomb in Jerusalem, but to stop the Ottoman advance in its tracks. What resulted was not a glorious victory, but a catastrophic and humiliating defeat that served as a brutal epilogue to 2 centuries of crusading, a final, bloody lesson in what happens when the fervor of the past collides head-on with the grim realities of the future. The call to this new crusade was issued with all the old fervor. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, known as the Thunderbolt for the speed and violence of his campaigns, was besieging the city of Constantinople itself. His relentless expansion threatened to extinguish the Byzantine Empire, the ancient Christian bulwark at the gates of Europe. In response, Pope Boniface IX preached a crusade, and the nobility of Europe, particularly from France and Burgundy, answered with unbridled enthusiasm. This was to be no mere expedition. It was a showcase of the very best of European knighthood. The army that assembled was a glittering tapestry of medieval arrogance, led by the finest and proudest nobles of the age, including the Count of Nevers, the future Duke of Burgundy. They were accompanied by a contingent of seasoned Knights Hospitaller from Rhodes, the last true veterans of the Crusader Wars. Yet from the very beginning, the enterprise was plagued by the same fatal flaws that had undone so many campaigns before it: a toxic blend of overconfidence, internal rivalry, and a profound disrespect for the enemy they were about to face. The campaign quickly descended into a parade of hubris. As the Crusader army marched through Hungary, it was joined by King Sigismund, a capable ruler who understood the Ottoman threat firsthand. He urged caution and a strategy of coordination with his own forces and those of his Wallatian and Transylvanian allies. The French and Burgundian knights, however, treated their allies with outright contempt. They dismissed Sigismund's advice, boasting that they alone would be sufficient to destroy the Turkish host. They even refused to wait for the Ottoman army to come to them, instead charging ahead in a reckless race to be the first to engage the enemy and claim the glory for themselves. When they finally reached the Ottoman-held fortress of Nicopolis on the Danube, they did not lay a careful siege. Instead, fueled by impatience and a sense of invincibility, they immediately prepared for a frontal assault against the well-defended walls, believing their sheer martial prowess would carry the day. Sultan Bayezid, a master strategist, was more than ready for them. He had chosen his ground with care, positioning his army on a high plateau behind the town. His deployment was a masterpiece of combined arms tactics that the Europeans completely failed to comprehend. In front, he placed a screen of irregular light infantry, the Azaps, and behind them, a forest of sharpened stakes designed to impale the charging horses of the European knights. Further back were the elite janissaries, his professional slave soldiers, standing firm with their composite bows and polearms, and on the flanks, hidden from view, waited the bulk of his formidable Sipahi heavy cavalry. The Crusaders, in their arrogance, saw only a disorganized rabble. Ignoring all of Sigismund's pleas for a coordinated attack, the French knights dismounted their crossbowmen, the one arm of their force that could have effectively countered the Turkish bows, and launched a headlong, uphill cavalry charge straight into the Ottoman line. The initial phase of the charge was deceptively successful. The knights smashed through the light infantry, and though taking terrible losses from arrow fire, even managed to break through the first line of janissaries. Believing the battle already won, they surged forward in disarray, their formations completely broken. This was the moment Bayezid had been waiting for. He unleashed his hidden reserves. Thousands of fresh Sipahi cavalry poured down from the flanks, slamming into the exhausted and disorganized knights. At the same time, Serbian heavy cavalry under Prince Stefan Lazarevic, loyal vassals of the Sultan, delivered a devastating blow to the Crusader flank. The battle turned in an instant. The charge of the European knights became a death trap. Surrounded and overwhelmed, the flower of French chivalry was cut down where they stood or captured for ransom. The rout was total. King Sigismund, who had held his own forces back, could only watch in horror as the Crusader army disintegrated before his eyes. He himself barely escaped the field by boat, fleeing down the Danube. The aftermath of Nicopolis was a scene of unparalleled humiliation and brutality. Hundreds of nobles were captured, and the next day, Bayezid, enraged by his own heavy losses, ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners. Only the wealthiest lords were spared for the enormous ransoms they would command. The battle was an unmitigated disaster that resonated across Europe. It signaled the definitive end of the Crusade as a viable military concept. The idea that an army of knights, motivated by faith and feudal pride, could defeat the disciplined, modern military machine of the Ottomans was proven to be a dangerous fantasy. Nicopolis exposed the profound military obsolescence of Europe and underscored the seismic shift in power towards the Ottoman Empire, which would remain a dominant threat for the next 300 years. It was a somber, bloody full stop at the end of the crusading era, a final proof that the world had moved on and that the lessons of adaptability and respect for the enemy, so hard-won in the Holy Land, had been completely and tragically forgotten. Yet even as the final Crusader strongholds clung to existence in the Holy Land, their fate was being decided not in the deserts of Palestine, but in the sparkling blue waters of the central Mediterranean. where a fierce and complex dynastic struggle was playing out for control of the most strategic island in the sea. The War of the Sicilian Vespers was, on its surface, a vicious civil war between two European royal houses, the French Angevins and the Spanish Aragonese, fighting for the crown of Sicily. But for the desperate garrisons in Acre and Tripoli, this was far more than a distant political squabble. It was a battle for their very lifeline. Sicily was the granary of the Mediterranean, and more importantly, the primary naval base and way station for every ship carrying knights, timber, weapons, and hope from Europe to the east. The Battle of Malta in 1283 was the pivotal naval engagement of this war, a clash that would determine who held the key to the sea lane, and by extension, who held the power to sustain or strangle the dying Crusader States. The conflict erupted from a tinderbox of resentment and ambition. The Angevin king, Charles of Anjou, ruled Sicily with an iron fist, his heavy taxes and arrogant French officials breeding deep-seated hatred among the local population. This resentment exploded on the evening of Easter Monday in 1282, in an uprising that began with the church bells of Palermo ringing for Vespers and ended with the slaughter of thousands of French inhabitants. The Sicilians immediately offered their crown to Peter III of Aragon, who had a dynastic claim through his wife and was more than eager to challenge Angevin dominance in the Mediterranean. Charles of Anjou, his power and prestige mortally wounded, marshaled his formidable fleet to crush the rebellion and reclaim his island. His strategy was straightforward: impose a crushing naval blockade to starve the Sicilians and their Aragonese allies into submission. The Aragonese, understanding that control of the sea meant control of the war, sent their own powerful fleet to break that blockade and keep the vital supply lines open. The two armadas, each representing the naval might of a rising European power, were on a collision course, and the island of Malta, sitting astride the narrow channel between Sicily and North Africa, was the logical place for their destinies to meet. The battle itself was a brutal and chaotic affair, a swirling melee of oar-driven galleys in the confined waters of Malta's Grand Harbour. Naval warfare in this era was less about sinking enemy ships and more about capturing them. The primary tactic was to ram an opponent to disable its oars, then pull alongside so that marines and knights could board and fight it out hand-to-hand on the decks, turning the sea battle into a series of bloody infantry engagements on floating platforms. The Angevin fleet, commanded by Charles's admirals, was confident and experienced, but the Aragonese, led by the talented Admiral Roger of Loria, had a crucial advantage: a fleet of lighter, more maneuverable galleys and a deep well of experience fighting in the cramped conditions of the Mediterranean. Loria, a master tactician, used the geography of the harbour to his advantage, likely funneling the heavier Angevin ships into positions where their numbers counted for less. The fighting was ferocious, with clouds of crossbow bolts darkening the sky, the air filled with the splintering of wood, the clash of steel, and the screams of men drowning in their heavy armor. When the sea finally grew calm, the outcome was clear. The Aragonese had won a decisive victory. Dozens of Angevin galleys had been captured or destroyed, and their naval supremacy in the central Mediterranean was broken. For the Crusader States, the ripple effect of this Aragonese victory was immediate and profound. With the Angevin fleet crippled, the sea lanes from Spain and Italy to the Levant became significantly safer for Christian shipping. Aragonese control of Sicily and the surrounding waters meant that supplies, reinforcements, and pilgrims could once again flow with less fear of interception by Angevin or their occasional Genoese allies. It granted the beleaguered outposts in Acre and Tyre a temporary but desperately needed respite. However, this lifeline came with a bitter irony. The very war that had secured their supply route also consumed the attention and resources of the European powers who might otherwise have sent aid. Peter of Aragon and Charles of Anjou were now wholly invested in their own bitter struggle for Sicily. Their knights, their ships, and their vast treasuries were poured into the War of the Vespers, not into a new crusade to save the Holy Land. The Battle of Malta perfectly illustrates the painful paradox of the late Crusader era. A victory for one Christian king could indirectly help the Crusaders, but the internal conflicts of Europe consistently diverted the massive effort needed to truly save them. It was a temporary fix to a terminal problem, a reminder that in the interconnected web of medieval geopolitics, a battle fought for a crown in a Maltese harbor could echo on the docks of Acre, a faint whisper of hope soon to be drowned out by the drums of a final, unstoppable siege. And so we arrive at the final, silent footnote in the 2-century-long saga of the Crusader States, not with a cataclysmic battle or the fall of a great city, but with the lonely extinguishing of a tiny flame on a rocky island just off the coast of Syria. This is the story of the Siege of Ruwad, a somber and almost forgotten epilogue that speaks volumes about the tragic end of an era. By the turn of the 14th century, the situation was beyond dire. The great Crusader capital of Acre had fallen back in 1291, followed in quick succession by the other remaining strongholds like Tyre and Sidon. The once proud kingdom of Jerusalem was now a memory, its territory entirely back under Muslim control. All that remained was a single, isolated speck of land, the small island of Ruwad, barely 2 miles from the port city of Tortosa. It was here, on this barren outcrop, that the Knights Templar made their last desperate stand, a final grasp at maintaining a foothold in the land they had sworn to protect. The Templars had occupied Ruwad for over a decade after the fall of the mainland, using it as a forward base for forlorn hopes and futile raids, a place from which they could still watch the coast they had lost. But its isolation was its greatest vulnerability. In the summer of 1302, the Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Kolul, the same ruler who had orchestrated the final victory at Acre, decided to snuff out this last ember of resistance. He dispatched a powerful fleet and a seasoned army to surround the island. For the Templar garrison, perhaps 300 brothers and a contingent of support troops, the sight on the horizon must have been one of grim finality. They were completely cut off, with no hope of relief from a Europe that had long since turned its attention elsewhere. The siege that followed was not a dramatic affair of epic assaults, but a slow, grinding process of starvation and despair, a quiet strangulation. The Mamluks, masters of siege warfare by this point, did not need to risk a costly amphibious assault. They established a tight naval blockade, preventing any supplies or reinforcements from reaching the island. On the landward side, their engineers set up their formidable trebuchets on the mainland coast, launching stones across the narrow channel to systematically demolish the island's fortifications and terrorize the defenders within. The Templars, true to their fierce reputation, held out for as long as humanly possible. They repaired breaches under a constant hail of projectiles and repelled any probing attacks. But with each passing week, their food stores dwindled, their walls crumbled, and their strength ebbed away. The once mighty military order, whose banners had flown over castles from Jerusalem to Antioch, was now reduced to a handful of hungry men on a rock, waiting for an end they knew was inevitable. The final act was one of both tragedy and bitter controversy. After a valiant defense that lasted for months, the garrison's situation became untenable. Facing annihilation, the Templars entered into negotiations with the Mamluk commanders. The terms offered were a chilling echo of past betrayals: surrender the island, and you will be granted safe passage. Whether driven by desperation or a flicker of hope, the remaining defenders agreed. They laid down their arms and opened the gates. The Mamluks poured onto the island, and in a brutal repetition of history, immediately broke their word. The Templar Knights were seized, bound, and marched to the mainland. There, in a final act of symbolic violence, they were executed to a man. The last armed Christian presence in the Holy Land was erased not in a blaze of glory, but in an act of perfidious murder. The fall of Ruad in 1302 was more than just the loss of another castle. It was the period at the end of a very long sentence. It marked the absolute, unequivocal end of the Crusader presence in the Levant. There were no more outposts, no more territories, no more claims. The 200-year project known as Outremer, the land across the sea, was over. The defeat hammered home the ultimate lesson of the entire endeavor, that without consistent, unified, and substantial support from the West, no amount of individual bravery, no strength of stone walls, and no fervency of faith could sustain a colonial enterprise surrounded by a hostile and resilient world. The lonely fate of the Ruad garrison stands as a poignant monument to the thousands who fought and died for a dream that ultimately evaporated into the sea mists of history, a silent and somber conclusion to one of the most dramatic and consequential eras the world has ever known. Yet even as the last Crusader garrisons were being systematically erased from the map, the single most pivotal event that sealed their fate had already occurred. Not between Franks and Mamluks, but on a dusty plain in northern Palestine where the future of the entire Islamic world hung in the balance. The year was 1260, and a storm of unimaginable ferocity was sweeping in from the east. The Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, had utterly annihilated every army sent to stop them. They had sacked and burned Baghdad, executing the last Abbasid caliph and extinguishing the symbolic heart of the Islamic world for centuries. They had crushed the assassins in their mountain fortresses and subjugated the great cities of Damascus and Aleppo. Their reputation was one of invincible terror. They were seen not merely as an army, but as a force of nature and divine punishment that could not be resisted. With their sights now set on Egypt, the last remaining major power in the region, it appeared that the entire Muslim Middle East was on the verge of being incorporated into the largest land empire history had ever known. The Mongol vanguard, led by the brilliant General Kitbuka, surged into Palestine, and the only force standing between them and total victory was a relatively new and untested power, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks were a unique phenomenon. They were a military caste of slave soldiers, predominantly of Kipchak Turkic origin, who had seized power in Egypt just a year earlier by overthrowing their own Ayyubid masters. Their new sultan, Qutuz, was a formidable leader, but he ruled a realm that was politically fragile and now facing an existential threat of the highest order. The strategic situation was a bizarre three-way standoff. The Crusaders, clinging to their fortified ports like Acre, watched this clash of titans from the sidelines, utterly terrified. Some within the Frankish camp, remembering the old dream of a Christian-Mongol alliance against Islam, were even tempted to grant the Mongol army free passage through their territory. It was a moment of ultimate peril for the Mamluks, who faced the prospect of fighting on two fronts. In a breathtaking act of pragmatic statecraft, Qutuz immediately dispatched envoys to Acre. He offered the Franks a simple, stunning deal, a formal truce. He promised to respect Crusader territory and even to discuss returning former Frankish lands if they would simply remain neutral and allow the Mamluk army to pass through to confront the Mongols. The desperate Franks, seeing the lesser of two apocalyptic evils, agreed. This single diplomatic masterstroke secured the Mamluks' northern flank, allowing them to march their entire army north without fear of being attacked from behind by the Crusader garrisons. The two armies met near the spring of Goliath Ain Jalut in Arabic, in a valley surrounded by the hills of Galilee. The Mamluk force, though outnumbered, held several crucial advantages. They were fighting for their very survival on familiar terrain, and their army was composed entirely of professional, full-time soldiers, much like their Mongol opponents. But their greatest asset was leadership, not just from Sultan Qutuz, but from one of his most talented generals, a man named Baybars. Baybars, a Kipchak Turk himself who had risen through the slave soldier ranks, understood Mongol tactics intimately. He knew they relied on feigned retreats, false gaps in their lines, and their incredible mobility to draw enemies into traps. At Ain Jalut, he and Qutuz turned the Mongols' own greatest weapon against them. Baybars commanded the vanguard and initiated the battle with a fierce attack, but after a period of intense fighting, he suddenly ordered a seemingly panicked retreat back toward the hills where the main Mamluk force was hidden. The Mongol general Kitbuka, confident and perhaps overeager, took the bait. He ordered a full pursuit, believing the Mamluk army was breaking and fleeing. His forces charged headlong into the valley, their formation stretching and losing its cohesion in the hot pursuit. This was the moment Qutuz had been waiting for. As the Mongol army poured into the killing zone, he unleashed the main Mamluk force from their concealed positions on the high ground. They slammed into the overextended Mongol flanks with shocking force. At the same time, Baybars's fleeing vanguard wheeled around and attacked from the front. The Mongols, renowned for their discipline, found themselves completely surrounded and trapped in a place not of their own choosing. The battle descended into a brutal, close-quarters melee where the Mamluk heavy cavalry and the Mongol lancers were evenly matched. The tide turned decisively when Sultan Qutuz himself, seeing the critical moment, ripped off his helmet so his men could see his face and shouted his famous battle cry, plunging into the thick of the fighting to inspire his troops. The Mongols, for the first time in living memory, were not just being challenged, they were being annihilated. General Kitbuka fought to the death and his army was routed. The Mongols would return to threaten Syria again in the future, but the aura of their invincibility had been shattered forever on that field. The immediate victory at Ain Jalut saved Egypt and preserved the Mamluk Sultanate. But its long-term consequences for the Crusader States were nothing short of catastrophic. By eliminating the Mongol threat, Qutuz and his successor Baybars, who would shortly assassinate Qutuz and seize the throne for himself, had freed up all their military and strategic attention. The great external pressure that had preoccupied the Islamic world for a generation was suddenly gone. The Mamluks were now the undisputed champions of the Muslim world, their legitimacy and power cemented by this legendary victory. And they immediately turned their vengeful gaze west toward the last, lingering Frankish presence on their coastline. The fragile truce with Acre was immediately discarded. Baybars, now the Sultan, embarked on a systematic, relentless campaign that would define the next 3 decades. Using the hardened veterans and the unshakable confidence gained from Ain Jalut, he began to pick off the Crusader strongholds one by one. The great castles that had stood for centuries cracked des Chevaliers, Montfort, Arsa fell to his armies. The victory that had saved Islam from the east had simultaneously signed the death warrant for the Crusader States in the west. Ain Jalut stands as the ultimate testament to the interconnectedness of history, a brutal demonstration of how a single battle in a remote valley can divert the flow of global events, creating unexpected victors and sealing the fate of empires that weren't even on the field that day. What truly emerges from the dust of these 25 forgotten battlefields is not a simple story of winners and losers, but a far more complex and human tapestry of cause and effect. The first and perhaps most crucial lesson is the absolute supremacy of logistics over sheer valor. We are often captivated by the image of the knight in shining armor, but his charge was meaningless if he had no bread to eat, no water for his horse, or no safe route for his supplies to reach him. The catastrophic failure of the Second Crusade at the walls of Damascus was not a military defeat in the traditional sense. It was a logistical collapse. The decision to abandon the fertile, resource-rich orchards for a barren plain left the army thirsty, hungry, and utterly vulnerable, proving that an army marches on its stomach long before it fights with its sword. Conversely, the successful siege of Sidon showcased the opposite principle. King Baldwin I's victory was not won by his knights alone, but by the Venetian ships that enforced a suffocating naval blockade, demonstrating that control of the sea lanes, the medieval equivalent of controlling the supply chain, could decide the fate of a campaign more decisively than any cavalry charge. Beyond the movement of material, the human element of leadership stands out in stark relief, revealing that the character of a single individual could alter the destiny of thousands. The Crusader era presents us with a gallery of leadership styles, each with its own consequences. On one end, we have the tragic arrogance of a Gerard de Riedfort at the Battle of Crescent, whose personal pride and refusal to heed wise counsel led 100 knights to a pointless slaughter, setting in motion the chain of events that would culminate in the disaster at Hattin. This is contrasted by the stunning, against all odds brilliance of a King Baldwin IV at Montezard. Here was a leader who, despite a body being consumed by disease, possessed a strategic mind and a courageous spirit so formidable that he could inspire a tiny, desperate force to achieve a miraculous victory against the greatest general of the age. And then there is the calculated pragmatism of a Sultan Baybars at the Siege of Safed, a master of psychological warfare who understood that promises could be a sharper weapon than swords, using deception to break a garrison's will from the inside after his engineers had weakened its walls from the outside. These battles teach us that leadership is not a monolith. It is a complex dance of intellect, charisma, humility, and sometimes ruthless pragmatism. Perhaps the most surprising theme that emerges from these overlooked conflicts is the fluid and unpredictable nature of alliances, which repeatedly defies the simplistic notion of a perpetual holy war between two monolithic blocks. The Crusader world was a dizzying kaleidoscope of shifting loyalties, where today's enemy could be tomorrow's necessary ally. The Battle of La Forbe presents the ultimate paradox, a combined Crusader army fighting side by side with their longtime Muslim rivals from Damascus against a third force of Khwarezmian mercenaries hired by Egypt. This was not a war of Christianity versus Islam, but a complex struggle for survival where political survival routinely trumped religious ideology. We see this again in the desperate diplomacy before Ain Jalut, where the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz successfully negotiated a temporary truce with the Crusaders of Acre to ensure his army would not be attacked from the rear while he faced the existential Mongol threat. These were not aberrations, they were standard practice. Local emirs would frequently ally with Frankish barons against rival Muslim princes, and Italian merchant republics would happily trade with sultanates while simultaneously fighting them. This constant interplay shows that the Crusades were less a clash of civilizations and more a messy, protracted struggle for power, land, and influence, where the color of one's banner was often less important than the strategic advantage they could provide. Finally, these forgotten battles force us to appreciate the profound role of cultural and technological exchange, a process where enemies learned from each other and, in doing so, became more formidable. The Crusaders did not arrive in the East as the sole bearers of military knowledge. They were often the students, The Siege of Al-Damis in Spain demonstrates how the Aragonese adopted and mastered the advanced siege engine technology of their Moorish opponents, using their own trebuchet designs against them. This knowledge, honed on the battlefields of the Reconquista, would then be carried east by military orders, cross-pollinating tactics across the Mediterranean. The disastrous Battle of Haran was a brutal but effective lesson in desert warfare, teaching the Crusaders the hard way that their heavy cavalry charges were useless against the agile horse archers of the Seljuk Turks, forcing them to adapt their tactics or face annihilation. This was a two-way street. Muslim armies likewise evolved to counter the strengths of the Franks, developing new fortification designs to withstand their sieges and adapting their own strategies to lure them into fatal traps, as seen at the Battle of Inab. This constant adaptation, this silent dialogue of violence and innovation between cultures, is one of the most significant and overlooked legacies of the entire era, proving that even in conflict, ideas are the most enduring currency. As we close this chapter on 25 conflicts lost to the margins of history, a profound truth comes into focus. The epic story of the Crusades was not written solely in the famous stone of Jerusalem or the bloody water of the horns of Hattin. Its most pivotal paragraphs were etched into the sun-baked earth of places like Azaz and La Forbe, in the desperate stands and fleeting triumphs that rarely made it into the chronicles penned for kings. These overlooked clashes were the true hinges of history, the moments where a single decision, a sudden betrayal, or an unexpected act of courage could reroute the destiny of continents for centuries to come. They teach us that the grand narrative we think we know is actually a mosaic, pieced together from countless smaller, human-scale struggles. This journey through the dust of forgotten fields reveals an era defined by its stunning complexity, not its simplistic divides. We've seen how a King Baldwin could partner with Venetian admirals one day and a Muslim emir the next, how the dream of a Christian-Mongol alliance could dissolve on the plains of Wadi al-Kosnodar over a simple miscommunication in the fog of war. The real Crusades were a tangled web of pragmatic alliances, where faith was often a banner under which more earthly ambitions, for land, for trade, for personal glory, were pursued. To reduce this period to a simple story of religious war is to miss its richest lessons about human nature, about how survival and opportunity can forge the most unlikely of partnerships and breed the most bitter of betrayals. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these hidden battles is their powerful reminder of human resilience. Time and again, we witnessed forces staring into the abyss of certain defeat, only to find a path forward through sheer ingenuity and grit. A young leper king defying his own failing body to lead a miraculous charge at Montezard, a surrounded Templar garrison holding out for months on the tiny island of Ruad, long after their kingdom had vanished from the mainland. This capacity to endure, to adapt, and to persevere against impossible odds is a timeless testament to the human spirit. Their stories, though centuries old, still resonate with a powerful urgency, challenging us to find our own strength in the face of modern adversities. Ultimately, these 25 battles invite us to become better students of history itself. They urge us to look beyond the textbook headlines and the famous names, to dig deeper into the soil where the true roots of change are buried. For every Saladin or Richard the Lionheart, there were 100 lesser-known commanders, soldiers, and diplomats whose choices collectively steered the course of events. By seeking out these hidden stories, we gain a richer, more nuanced, and infinitely more human understanding of our past. We learn to appreciate the fragile interplay of logistics, leadership, and pure chance that truly shapes our world. So the next time you encounter a grand historical event, pause and ask yourself, what forgotten struggles laid the groundwork for this moment? Your curiosity will be its own reward. If this exploration has inspired you to look closer at the shadows of history, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more journeys into the past. Let us know in the comments which of these forgotten battles you found most compelling. Until our next adventure, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop uncovering the incredible stories that